we're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hello, heathens, and welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Zinnia, and today I also have a co-host, someone everyone knows already, Heather.
Hello.
Woo!
And we have a special guest. That little woo in the background is Amy.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thank you.
All right, so today we have a very special episode. Amy had reached out to me because she actually did her master's thesis on women in the Christadelphian community. Today, we are going to be reviewing that. Me and Heather both had the rare chance to read this, and there's some really fantastic quotes we're going to share with you, and we're going to have a great conversation now that it's been how many years since you wrote this, Amy?
Well, that was 96 to 98, so 98, so 25 years, 26,
Wow.
I guess, technically. Yes, I am old.
Why don't we just get to know you a little bit first? So why don't you tell us, were you born into the Christadelphians?
Yes, very much so. Similarly to the two of you, my family's been in the Christadelphian religion since, on my father's side, goes back to probably the late 1800s. My mother's side is probably a little more new, more like the early 1900s, but for a long time.
Okay, and then how long were you in the group, or how old were you when you left?
I left my last year of college, so pretty much I graduated that spring and headed out after that. So that now has been about 30 years.
Okay, so why don't you tell us how this thesis played a role and where you were in the process of leaving? When was that, before, during, after writing this thesis?
It was very much after, but now that as I'm looking back on it, is about 5 or 6 years, and I had gone to grad school. I finished my undergrad degree and then went and taught elementary school for a little while, and then I was like, I really want to go back. I'm thinking about becoming a college professor. I started applying to schools, and I thought naively at the time, maybe I would like to study theology because I'd like to spend my life sort of thinking about how all of this works. But what I was particularly interested in was the idea of the psychology of religion, because I was paying a lot of attention to the idea of what makes some people religious and other people not religious, or what makes people want to stay in a certain church versus other people want to leave. And I read some great books. One in particular, actually I should get his last name, but the book was called The Psychology of Religious Doubt. And the idea of doubt being in a more kind of conservative church being something that was sinful, and in a more liberal setting is something that would be encouraged as a positive thing. And sort of that psychology of doubt and that psychology of liberalism versus conservatism was really interesting to me. So I was applying to all these schools. I applied to, and I got accepted to one out in California, University of California, Santa Barbara, moved there. The irony of coming from a tiny little church that no one's heard of and joining a religious studies department means that everybody's very interested in what you're studying or what your background is. So I ended up doing a lot of talking to people about what my background was, which was not what I was planning on thinking about as a scholar. But they just were really fascinated by this group, like, who's this group and where'd they come from? And we don't have a lot of scholarship about this. Maybe you could write something about this. And I was like, all right, fine.
So was it kind of that they were pushing you towards this, like your mentors?
Pretty much they were like, this is really fascinating. If you're interested in the psychology of religion, or maybe you can think more about sort of the women's, because a lot of what you talk about as a person who was in that church and a lot of thinking about why you decided to leave was a lot of how women are not, cultivated as people with their own ideas and ability to, be able to be useful in the church as the men are. And, is there a way you can share that? Is there a way you can talk about that, in a degree? And so I was like, all right, fine. It was more like they were trying to shape it toward what could, because because it was a sociology program and not a psychology program, they wanted it to be more sociological. So it was sort of a
Behaviors.
natural output of the kind of program I was in. So I was like, and it was really interesting. And to be fancy here, but anthropologically speaking, this kind of church and how to get data from a group like this, who is pretty much a snapshot, if you think about it, of I'm going to use the word anachronism, which is, if you're familiar with the idea of an anachronism, it's something that pretty much hasn't changed over time. It looks pretty much exactly as it did, even though everything around it has changed. And this group is sort of by nature anachronistic. And I talk about that in my thesis. And I'm not trying to be fancy here. They are like a little bit like a time travel piece in that. And so what's interesting about them is because they don't have a central leadership, because they specifically do not want a central leadership, it forces the group to almost treat Robert Roberts and John Thomas as the leadership. And once they said everything, and even though they say it's not divine, some of the people in the church will
not prophets,
Well, yeah, they're like prophets, but maybe God kind of guided them, but but they're not divine. True. Yeah.
It's like one step below inspired work. It's like, oh, God wanted them to discover this, but he didn't, directly communicate it to them.
Exactly. So because they don't have someone to come along and say, well, think about, we're living in different times now. There's issues that have come up. As the leader, here's my word coming down. They're not alive to do that anymore. So people just have to kind of make up stuff around that and then sort of keep these main, what do we call them, first principles right in the middle, and the stuff around it, like, I don't know, abortion, for example, or I don't even know, like women working outside of the home, or 18 million other things that have come up in other churches, and other churches have had their leadership sort of make declarations on. For example,
they can make changes. They're flexible.
Coca-Cola, they're not allowed to drink caffeine, but they're allowed to drink Coca-Cola because the Mormon church leadership said Coca-Cola is okay. But we didn't have anybody in the Christadelphian church to make that change. So that's, my little digression on what makes them particularly interesting.
Yeah, and we'll actually get into that because you'd mentioned that in your thesis, and I am excited to talk about that a little bit more. I think that is great. It's definitely like an 1800s religion.
Yeah, and it sort of the Catholicism of the church still. It was still around when I was in the church. So there's just other elements of it that really have that whiff of like, why is that important? And it's because it was important 150 years ago. So it's still in there. It's still built into the system.
So I didn't realize that you did this after leaving. So I'm really curious. And I really love the research that you did. You did interviews with people. It sounded like you may have even done like surveys and things like that. You were going to events, talking to women in 2 different ecclesias, one on the West Coast, one kind of in the Midwest of the United States for your research. How did the women in these ecclesias react to all these interviews and questions? Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So it was definitely a little tricky and awkward for me, but my in was Christadelphianism is so small, you're pretty much related to somebody somewhere. So, so I cheated a little on the Midwestern one. Is that it was, the church I grew up in. So I had access to those folks, and I had a relative in California area, and she helped me connect with the women. And I approached it. She, everyone knew that I had been a Christadelphian, but it had been a little while. And I was very careful to keep my questions scholarly. I mean, I wasn't like, why do you stay when it doesn't make sense? I mean, that wasn't my approach. And in fact, that wouldn't be a scholarly approach or an anthropology.
Okay, so tact was key.
Right. And I have to say, learning how to talk that way and learning how to think that way was so helpful for me in sort of learning how to be objective, like from a scholarly perspective. It was a really helpful way to be able to take a step back from that emotionality of leaving, which is really painful and hard and, takes a lot of work.
So this was like almost a part of your healing process after leaving,
I
it sounds
I
like.
don't think I was yes, I think I didn't realize it at the time, but it kind of ended up being that way.
Yeah, because it wasn't
It has
intentional.
and it has allowed me to continue to sort of be able to switch to that instead of getting enraged. Sometimes I can be like, all right, well, from a scholarly perspective, this is actually very normal behavior. But from a personal perspective, it drives me crazy, kind of. But
that is really helpful to think about it that way, though. I'll have to remind myself to put on my scholarly hat if I'm,
yeah,
in the future when I'm doing this kind of thing.
I mean, it's when it's your family, you're naturally gonna be triggered by all kinds of stuff, but
Yeah.
you just can't help it. And then because the church community becomes essentially an extended family in so many ways, it just is that much more potent. So I definitely approached it in a scholar. I mean, that was, if I hadn't done it that way, it wouldn't have been acceptable as a thesis. I mean, it's a research facility. The University of California doesn't mess around. So I had to do things right. I couldn't, do it sloppy. And I felt good about it. And I felt like it was actually the point of the thesis ends up, there is a summary of it, but as I was rereading it, the point is to sort of compare the Christadelphians to other conservative religious groups and why women join them or why women leave, why women stay in them. And are the reasons why the women either join the churches or stay in the churches similar to women in other sort of scholarly work done on conservative Christian women? And my thesis pretty much says, yes, it's very similar, with the sort of slight difference of the majority of Christadelphian women don't convert in. I mean, there are definitely plenty of them who convert in through marriage, but the majority of them are in the church because they were born into the church. Whereas that is not as much a factor in a lot of conservative Christian churches. And then the way that people, and just as another side note, the way people have thought about women joining conservative Christian churches has shifted over time. I think 30, 40 years ago, when people were thinking about why would a woman knowingly and, give up her agency to join a church where she will lose power, where she will be told that she can no longer speak, where she will be told that she isn't able to operate, or work outside the home or whatever. And it must be because she's being brainwashed, was the sort of mentality for a long time, whether in scholarly circles or outside of. Whereas by the time I was in school, it was definitely this idea of choice, that women do actively make a choice to join these churches. And there are good reasons for them to join these churches. And they're not doing it because they're brainwashed. They're doing it because they want to have a different kind of life than what they'd had before they were in the church. And what that kind of life is might vary or what the kind of life they want might be somewhat variable from woman to woman, but often it was about sort of that stability of a family within a church setting that might not be as stable, or a partner who might be more stable or, more willing to follow rules than someone who is outside of the church. So that was also
a lot.
To be able to compare the Christadelphians and say, well, actually, they're very similar, was really helpful. And again, with that scholarly objectivity, was being like, oh, they're not just this wacky group coming out of nowhere. They're a lot. This is what women do, and there are good reasons for why they do what they do.
Yeah, I've thought about that even with my own family, wondering, because my mom joined the group as an adult. So I've wondered, what did she get out of joining? Why did she stay? And both of my aunts as well came in. So I was kind of wondering. And so knowing a little bit about my mom's background, I think the stability, some of that stuff, I think looking to have a different life than the one she was raised in, I could definitely see some of those things being an incentive. I think it definitely gave her some stability and community and things like that.
Totally. It's a very powerful community.
Yeah, but it's interesting. And I'm sure they didn't love hearing like, oh, yeah, you're the same as other conservative groups. But we're going to dive into what makes them unique. And I was wondering if part of this project started from this one quote. I really loved it. So I want to share it, that you had found in a Christadelphian magazine from 1883.
Oh, yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah, so it reads, I pity women of the Christadelphian sisterhood, for those who wield the sword of truth cut her off from the aim in life of those about her. To go with the world, she can follow almost any intellectual pursuit: law, medicine, speaking, writing, literature. And when this was expressed, a Christadelphian man replied to this. And he wrote in the next edition of the magazine, why not add a department for sisters' correspondence to the children's magazine? What are women as a rule, but children of larger growth? it is difficult for them to attain to the cold white heights of a man's understanding, judgment, and logic. A woman gets happiness through the affections, never through the intellect.
No.
Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cringe. Yeah.
yeah, because I remember later in your thesis, you're like, oh, I wonder if there's other sisters that have this. Like, does this reflect a more common sentiment? And you really didn't find that. There wasn't really a lot of
No.
women saying that they weren't happy or that they were sad that they weren't able to pursue these things. Like she mentioned law, medicine, all these career opportunities and things like that. So it is interesting. I really can't believe that they just said that women are basically just children and should be treated as such.
Well, it's funny that you brought that up, and I really did I worked through basically every issue of the Christadelphian since whatever year, flipped through
Oh,
it,
wow.
especially the letters sections, kind of looking through, because they're the only place that women could actually have anything published because they don't write the articles. Although as time went on, sometimes a woman would write up there would be an article by a woman.
Yeah, I see
But it was
some now in the modern day.
Yeah, it's never, and let's be real also, the Christadelphian magazine is never fully meant to be kind of an internal magazine. It's meant to be something open to all and to be used as a tool, I think, to some degree for, I don't know necessarily for conversion, but it's not meant to be an opportunity for people to kind of argue or debate. It's definitely meant to be more of a PR piece,
Yeah, I always think of it also as just their way of connecting all of these disconnected ecclesias.
Yeah.
Because this is one thing that unites them all. Is like they're all reading this. So if you have an issue, it also seemed like that was their way of doing PR, being like, hey, everyone, we need to kind of get you guys in line because I hear there's like a debate about this topic or whatever. So they'd send out an issue covering that topic to everyone, trying to keep everyone on the same page.
Yeah, I think it served as a kind of central leadership, even without like that central leadership that we talked about, and how can you really argue back to something that's already published? I mean, you can write a letter and they might something about your disagreement might show up in the next issue, but it's not like it's really a back and forth.
There was always a power differential there too. It's like they're going to choose even if they reply to your letter or to publish it or whatnot.
Absolutely. Whereas I think there, with all of the sort of Facebook groups or bulletin boards or whatever that has developed in the past, 20, 30 years, maybe there is more, back and forth than there has ever been before. Although I don't think it's something that's available. It's not something that most Christadelphians are engaging in, I don't think, on a regular basis.
So I guess we can talk a little bit about gender norms. And you had already kind of said that this is kind of a time capsule. And so even in your thesis from the 90s, it said gender norms have not changed much since the mid 1800s. And I definitely think that is accurate. When you just think about the role of women, it was generally motherhood, serving men, like with food. When you look at the opportunities, women are pretty much told to be quiet. And there was another quote you had supplied in your thesis, quoting a prominent Christadelphian brother who I know I've heard speak. He's, as far as I know, still around. But he had said that the teachings on submission are too incompatible with women preachers, women's lib, career wives, unisex dress, and equality of the sexes. That's the environment of the world. And as we know, the world is a very bad place. So you wouldn't want any of that.
Right.
So it's pretty interesting that right from the get-go, that's how they separate themselves. It's like, these are all these modern things. We can't have those. We like the 1800s.
Yeah, but they're not so different from however many other conservative Christian groups.
One of the other things that I actually had never thought of that you pointed out in your thesis was that discussion of gender roles isn't in the official documents of the group. It's not in the statement of faith. It's literally not in there. I never really thought about it. I was so used to just seeing what was there and kind of skimming through and not really being that interested. And like I never noticed like women aren't even in there. It's almost like the Declaration of Independence where slaves were not considered people. And so, that was not addressed. The rights of Black people, the rights of women was not addressed in there. They weren't really seen as people. They were seen as property. And so these documents were written in a time period where there was no equal rights. And so you're completely written out of it, basically. And even with this, it wasn't even seen as important to discuss during the lifetimes of John Thomas and Robert Roberts. I guess in my mind, I think women were so stable almost in that place of
Mm.
submission that it wasn't like, oh, we should really outline this to make sure this never changes. Like, I think they were very confident that society would kind of always subjugate women, I would
Yeah,
imagine. That's
yeah.
my thought.
Well, and I think for the most part, within the structure of the individual ecclesias, that has stayed pretty consistent. Although you do hear about, a church in the middle of nowhere where they let the women serve, or this church over here where somebody's
Hmm.
doing something.
Yeah, very
And
rarely.
I
But yeah.
guess maybe 10, 15 years ago, when we were the sort of the ex Christadelphian group was kind of a newer Facebook group, in the late 2010, the aughts, I guess we call them now. I had a conversation back and forth with a woman in Australia who actually said there's some fairly liberal Christadelphian ecclesias in Australia that,
Mhm.
and there's women who have some sort of, created their own kind of special enclave of kind of their own version of Christadelphian feminist scholarship. And I was super intrigued, but I never really was able to get too much more information about it. But it
Yeah, I
happens.
don't know anything about it either. I just know it exists. I've never
Yes,
been
it's almost like
exposed
a
to it
myth
really.
or like a rumor.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a unicorn.
Yes.
yeah.
Someone send us their Spotify recorded exhortation
Oh,
so we can
it would
hear
be
it and
so
see what's actually
cool.
going
Yeah, it
on.
would be amazing.
Because there's lots of talks by brothers online. I remember seeing one of his sisters. So
No, oh gosh.
A couple years ago, when during COVID, I know that they did some online Bible schools when they couldn't meet in person. And
Oh,
I looked at the agenda, and they did have a couple of sisters classes, but then there
okay.
was like a little note that was like, sisters classes will not be recorded. And I wondered if it was
Oh.
because they didn't want any brothers, accidentally hearing the sister speaking or something, or if the sister just maybe the one that was giving the talk felt like shy and didn't want
Hmm.
her stuff broadcasted. But I just thought it was interesting because all the men's classes were available to watch like the recording of or to listen to the recording, but the
Yeah.
women, not all the women's were. I think some of them might have been, but not all of them.
The interesting part of that is on the flip side, you pointed out that basically all of the rules that women follow are just tradition. They aren't actual written rules. They're just part of the culture, and that's how they're done. And you pointed out ones that I'd never even thought of because you said the Christadelphian argument, the main one is I think Paul says in the New Testament that women should be silent, basically. They shouldn't
mhm.
speak. You shouldn't hear them. And so you pointed out, you're like, well, there are silent ways to serve. Like you could do the doorkeeping, you can pass the bread and wine. You don't talk then. So they could be silent and still be of service in the community. So why is it that they're not? It doesn't say in the rules that they can't. And I wonder if this was a conversation that happened in Australia in that ecclesia, because at that point it's saying just, well, the men have always said that we can't do it. It's
Yeah.
just traditionally we can't do it.
I asked them about it, and they said, and some of them said, well, I just feel like it's fine, and it's not like something I want to do anyway.
Hmm.
And other people said things like, well, let's just say it's fine. Like they were
Mm,
clearly annoyed by it, but they were like,
yeah.
I'm not going to rock. And some of them said, I'm not going to rock the boat. It was like a quote I got from one of them. It's like, nope, not me.
Yeah. I think I think especially with like unless they're having conversations about it and they want to organize to disrupt, they're never going to because why would you want to be singled out and potentially ostracized? And there's like going to be those social repercussions for speaking out
Totally.
against how it
Yeah.
was. And especially when you have a whole community, like even if you get your ecclesia on board, you travel to another ecclesia, boom, you're
Right.
back in the same place. You
Yeah.
can't change the whole organization.
Yeah. Activism is not a skill that is encouraged for one thing. And
Good
for
point.
two is just like, what would be the benefit? I mean, like,
Yeah.
you know, it's just, I know when I was in the church, and I was thinking, I had these thoughts, and I think I even had a conversation with my dad about it. And he was like, well, if you really want to be able to serve the emblems, I don't know, it's something we think about. And I was like, oh, whatever. I was just like,
Yeah.
what good would it do? I mean, what I
Yeah.
really wanted to do was be able to give exhortations and be able to talk because I had all these
Exactly.
ideas for great
Yeah.
exhortations. And why did, so and so who, probably wasn't really that great of a speaker, I
Mm-hmm.
could do so much better. And
Mm-hmm.
they're and my
Mm-hmm.
and my dad was trying really hard to be kind and accommodating. He was like, well, you can write them and we can write some together.
Oh, aw.
Yeah.
That was his
He
compromise.
was trying really hard to
Which is thoughtful because I've been totally shut down. And I remember I loved public speaking. I loved reading. I loved
totally,
research and stuff. Like I had all of the skills that would have made me great at exhortations. And I
totally.
was like, all right, you don't want me, fine. I'll make a podcast
Yeah.
with all these women you didn't want. All
Yeah.
these talented women who can write and speak. Here we are.
That makes me crazy. That is, and it says it. I have it in my thesis where I was like, "There's always women in every single ecclesia." Everyone's like, "Oh, she's the
Yeah, she's
super
a
wise
walking
woman of the
Bible.
walking
Yeah.
Bible, who knows more than everyone else." I
Oh,
think every
yeah.
single ecclesia has at least one of those. And it, even in that magazine that you sent, the issue that you sent to me, Zinnia,
I sent you an issue of the Tidings, which I'll link in the show notes.
yes, it has. So there is an editorial at the very beginning, and the editorial's by a man, and then all the stuff about motherhood, there's 10 articles or whatever about motherhood written by women, but the editorial, it's like an opening prayer by the man, so that way it's
Good point. It's almost like a sister's class, so he's like, well, I gotta get in on this and give the prayer.
Yes. And I just noticed it because it just was like, oh, okay, because it felt so discordant to me to have that, because I'm so not used to it now, that it was like, wait, why is he writing in this? Oh, okay, yes, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Fine. But he said, I think
he's also the editor. I think when I looked at who it was, yeah. So maybe he writes all of them. I don't know.
Yeah. And so I that makes sense. He's doing his editorial at the beginning. And then he has a passage sort of toward the end where he's like, no one, I would never question that women are just as capable as men as doing a scholarly work. Like he's very explicit there. Okay. And I'm like,
very feminist.
Going on a limb there.
Okay.
And then immediately nothing happens. Like, what are they going to do with that scholarliness? Like,
that was just to make you feel better. There's a breadcrumb.
And I'm not trying to be mean here, but it's sort of like he just puts it out there, and then he's like, yeah. And then it goes on, but where it really is important is with, taking care of the family, the taking care of the future generations. That is where women can be their most helpful. That is where they can be, what is it? Mothers of Israel. And I was just like,
one thing I noticed with that,
that's just gone. Poof.
It seems like with that magazine, and just glancing through to see like what they're publishing and what stories are going on, it feels like a lot of people who want to see the community change are involved in that writing, in that periodical, because a lot of them seem to be on a more progressive end of the spectrum of Christadelphians based on what they're saying, but I think they also realize they can't change anything. So it was really weird reading a lot of the articles, because it seems like a lot of them have those little comments like that, where it seems like they're like, oh, we should be doing this and that. And I'm like, wow, that would improve your community. But I know that community is not made for that kind of.
Exactly. It can't change.
Like, you can say that, but what are you going to do? Like, you can't change anything. You're not pushing for change. You're just saying these things that make it imply that you wish you could. Like, it feels like, it feels like people who wanted to see it changed and aren't the best fit with traditional Christadelphia. Because it feels like these are the more progressive people who realize there's problems and they want to fix it, so they're involved in trying to do like this PR work, but the PR work's not going to fix it when it's a systemic issue.
It is it's exactly it. It's like, it is an anachronism, and if you try to make it not an anachronism, if you try to make it more updated, then it's no longer Christadelphian.
Exactly. I agree with that. And I think that's going to come out in a lot of episodes, because we're going to look at things that have harmed people, things that are outdated, looking at things more modern. There's also an LGBTQ episode we're going to talk about. And so it's like, is that compatible with different views, on that issue with Christadelphia? And, I don't really think it is. I think it's the same way with this episode. We're going to talk a lot about feminism. Is feminist views compatible with an 1800s patriarchal structured organization? Like, fundamentally at its core, it's really not made for that. And if you push that, I feel like it would crumble the foundation. They have to create something new, and then it's not the Christadelphians anymore. It's something similar, but it's not the same.
It's a very brittle box to live in. And frankly, a big part of why I left is, we don't have to get too personal about it, but it's just that airlessness. It's so brittle. And they're so rigid, because if you change it, like you said, it's no longer Christadelphian. So there's no room for movement. There's no room for energy. There's no room for new life, because
grow or evolve.
Then it's no longer what it is.
Yeah.
So unless, and I like, when I even try to go there, and it's just like, how could that even work? I mean, there would have to be someone who took it and ran with it. But then if that's the case, or if they want to keep it decentralized, you're just never going to have, you're just going to keep splintering. I mean, that's the only thing you can do is just splinter.
And
Which is
that's what
what they've
we've seen
done.
happen. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And that'll be a whole nother episode talking about the splits, and many of us know something about it, but we'll try to cover that more later.
But that explains the splinters. I mean, that's why they have them, is because the church as a whole can't change.
Yeah, it's so rigid. Anytime there's any variation, they're like, oh, we're going to split because we can't accept a change.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting too, because I'm talking about a lot on this podcast about history. The first history episode just came out the same day we were recording this episode. And so I talk a lot about Thomas and Roberts. And as you had already kind of pointed out here, is that they set up all of the first principles. And then in your thesis, you wrote that Christadelphians insist that what the Bible says always makes sense. This notion that the Bible is trivially obvious, combined with a lack of central authority, which we just discussed, results in a kind of absence of theology in general. An explicit theology requires a hierarchy to interpret and prioritize. Hence, the Christadelphians only maintain a certain set of doctrines and do not explore much outside of them. For Christadelphians, since the Bible is trivially obvious, all interpretations, norms, and social roles are trivially obvious and, therefore, unquestionable. And again, I thought this was really great analysis, Amy. So I really loved how you worded things. It felt very professional to read this and very sharp. So I loved it because it really made me think about things I had never thought about. I never thought about the lack of hierarchy. I thought that was just a good thing. So I remember it was like, okay, like this is one reason why we can say we're not a cult, because we don't have like this leader that we're listening to.
Yeah.
I think it's also helped preserve the Christadelphian from worse scandals than they've had, because you can't have one person power grab and make it where everyone's giving them money or where they take over certain things. Because I've seen that in a lot of small conservative groups. And then that's when they start having these legal things, and that's when they start getting arrested and charged with things like drama, like really serious consequences happen, the mass suicides. You think of like cults, that kind of thing. It's where that happens. But here it stays the same, but it's interesting how the social aspect is so sharp where you can't even question it. You'll never have to, worry about like one person power grabbing, but you can never change anything. That's like the trade-off. And I never thought about that, the problems that come up from having no central authority, no pope, no pastor comes in. I remember I visited one church and their pastor had died like a year or two before. And so they were in the process of bringing in a new pastor. And I happened to go the week they introduced this new person. And I was like, oh, wow. Like it was interesting to see, like they did a transfer of leadership basically. And he paid respect to the old one and then came in and made some changes and, kept running it. And they had someone at the top of the hierarchy and allowed them to function and make changes, and things got better. The website was suddenly more functional. Like, great. All right. Someone was there to make that decision.
But isn't that kind of what the arranging brethren are for? Like they're sort of the decision makers, at least in each ecclesia.
I feel like on trivial things, like should we spend, more money on this? I remember them, handling some of the technical sides of operating an ecclesia.
Yeah, that's true.
Like they make sure the bills get paid, that someone records the minutes for the meetings, like small stuff.
Also, there were levels of AB meetings, and then I think sometimes there were like regional gatherings of ABs and stuff like that. But it was always very secret. Like Dad's.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. So yeah,
why would we? Because we were women. We were not involved as we were. There's no the ASs. It was all AB. So
yeah, the ASs. That does not sound bad at all. The ASSs. We'll get t-shirts.
Yeah. The Arranging Sisters. Revenge of the Arranging Sisters.
Wait, I actually wanted to, there's one quote that I pulled out that I was like, oh, we could make that the title of the episode. Apparently, one brother, I think you wrote in the article, said, or in your thesis, sorry, had said, they described women in Christadelphia as Harbingers of Destruction. Oh. And I was like, oh, that's like, imagine that like being announced in the ring and we like all run in and it's like a big wrestling match. It's like,
introducing the heretics of the meeting, the black sheep of the family, the Jezebels of the modern day, the Harbingers of Destruction.
No, that's amazing. That's so badass. And like also insulting, but like badass.
Yeah, right.
But it is, I mean, it is truly at its core, not just in the Christadelphians, but in any patriarchal system, which shockingly, I know this is crazy, but we live in one even outside of the Christadelphians. That was a lovely wake-up call when I got into academia and realized that was also a patriarchal system. And then, to be in the company I work for, or every company I've ever worked for is basically, whatever.
Yeah, it is
Yep.
very common. Yep.
Yeah, it's a little,
Sexism.
but for women, to do things differently and to no longer be willing to be focused solely on children and want to do things other than that is really, a way to underpin the thing that keeps patriarchy moving. And if we sort of refuse to do any more child rearing, I mean, oh my God, it's scary because these are the folks with power, and if you take the power away, nobody's happy.
They're not happy, no.
Well, they're not happy.
There was actually one other thing I wanted to loop back to about just that Christadelphian article, like the tidings. I had noticed actually in the same thought of it being reinforced by tradition, them not having the hierarchy and all of that, that often when I was looking at articles, I noticed that a lot of them just asked questions instead of offering guidance. And I think I kind of want to point this out to see, again, if other people see it, because one example I went to was another article called An Exploration of Christadelphians' Racism and Activism. And I remember seeing this a few years ago, so I was trying to find it for this episode because it reminded me of it on that topic. And I remember they were doing polls on their website a lot. And I think we even heard about it. Heather's already smiling.
Yeah.
Where they would do polls every month, and they would ask like, oh, like, how do you feel about like racism and protest? Like, do you think we should protest? Do you think we should do that? And I think that was the one where some of the ex-Christadelphians may have voted.
I think there was also like a LGBTQ one that we all like went in and
probably
voted on too.
There was at least one where the ex-Christadelphians may have voted in it.
Yeah.
I mean, it didn't say you couldn't.
Yeah, I didn't know about this.
Yeah, they do it every month, so you can always vote in these polls on the Tidings website. It's a Christadelphian periodical based in America and the United, or maybe just North America. So I think there's some Canadians on it. Just from looking at who's there, I've met a number of people who run that magazine, so I know some of them. But it was interesting because they have no power, like you said, even being, again, something that's distributed widely and having influence, they have no power. And so they share two stories that they claim are written by Christadelphians. So I'll say, okay, it's probably true. I don't know, one of them was kind of weird, but whatever. I was like, this just doesn't sound right, but I'm just going to assume that they're telling a totally honest story. But in the end, they start asking like a lot of questions. And it was like, literally this part I just copy and pasted. Has something like this ever happened in your life? How did you handle it? What lessons did you learn? And I'm like, okay, like, is this like geared towards kids? This feels like, what color did you wear today? Like just these silly questions where it's like these, I was like, is this like a devotional? Like this feels like one was like, read a day, like one a day and, you know, think about your life and meditate on it. And I was just like, this feels ridiculous. And it was just so odd because they're trying to tackle this huge issue. Like racism is a huge issue. This was written during the Black Lives Matter movement. And so it's like, okay, this is an important subject. I imagine there's a diversity of opinions on this, you know, as people are like, oh, we should treat people like people, and other people, you know, don't share that view, have more traditional views, things like that. And they just can't say, like, we support this. We are going to do this. We're going to do better. Here's a game plan. Here's training. Here's like any resource that would make a substantial difference to people's lives. There wasn't a lot of stuff of like, hey, here is someone of color who's in this community who wants to write about this. I think it was written by a white woman. And so again, it's like, what is happening here? Like, what are you trying to do? Because I don't think you're doing anything here. You're not highlighting the voices of the people, you know, who are most impacted by this. You're not guiding people to do better who are causing harm to other communities and people in their communities. And now that I've heard your view about it, where it's all tradition and where hierarchy has made it so that they're incapable of changing, now I see it everywhere. And this is just one place where I saw it. So I wanted to point that out because, again, like I think other people in our group, other people who leave Christadelphians or have some overlap, you know, some of us still have family members. So I might go to my parents and see the tidings out and like flip through it, you know, those kinds of things where you're still exposed to it and you can just see it. once you know to recognize and have that idea in your head. So I thought that was really valuable that you brought that up in your thesis, and I did want
Oh,
to
good.
really go into
Yeah.
that.
Well, just that tightrope they're always, I think, trying to walk between, trying to encourage everyone and be relevant and, connect to the young people and the old, they're trying to walk this line
Mm-hmm.
and not say anything that might upset anyone. Like in talking about, I mean, anyone talking about racism, doesn't matter where you're coming from. It's tricky.
Yes,
And
obviously.
this group does not have any sophistication around any of those topics because they can't really bring it in. There isn't really space for that.
And it's not
in what
like
they
it's
do.
specifically mentioned in the Bible as like, oh, be really nice to people of all color and gender and races and abilities. Like,
Right.
that's not in that one. That's not in the Bible. It's like, oh, if your slave wants to
Yeah.
stay, put a stake through their ear and now they're
Yeah,
yours
yeah.
forever. I'm like, oh, yes, that's maybe not the most helpful on these topics. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
It's a tough line for them to walk. I give them respect. They're trying hard to like make it all work, but at the same time, there isn't any. I mean, there are maybe now. There are places where people can kind of battle it out, like I said earlier. But I mean, I wasn't at the time. I mean, the internet was still embarrassingly new at
yeah,
that point.
true,
So,
true.
there probably are places. In fact, I'm almost sure there are Christadelphian, Facebook
Yeah,
groups
I
where
have
people
seen a
kind
few Facebook groups
of
coming
get
up
into that.
for some of these issues, like women's stuff. I think LGBT even might, or some things like that.
And there's probably all kinds of
Yeah.
mini subgroups just like, within
Yeah,
that,
I think
naturally.
there's more conversations happening now that the internet is around for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
But with the tidings, they, like I said, I think that they have their heart in the right place. I think they realize
Yeah.
there is a problem. We want to do something, but their hands are so tied by the structure of the Christadelphians that they are incapable of really pulling it off to implement change. And so they just do this kind of like, we'll just kind of talk about it. I think they realize like, hey, this is important. We should talk about it. People are talking about it. They're doing these polls and stuff to be like, okay, like let's see what our community thinks on this topic. And then it's just totally, ineffective kind of article comes out.
Yeah. There's
So,
nowhere to go. There's just no room. Yeah.
I think there's good people there that just are stuck and they're just kind of like going in a circle. I think maybe we should talk a little bit about elections briefly. I did do a poll in the ex-Christadelphian Facebook group because I did not realize that some ecclesias didn't allow people to vote, because in my ecclesia, it was anyone who was baptized. It was men and women could vote in ecclesial elections as much as Christadelphians don't vote in political elections, in whatever country that they're in. And even yesterday I saw Robert Roberts' ecclesial guide, and I just double checked it before our episode, and he describes the elections as including the sisters. So at its founding, women were meant to be able to vote, because he writes on page 31 of that guide, which is available as a PDF online if you Google for it, that all names nominated should be submitted in printed voting form to the brothers and sisters who will write it. And so he specifically includes the sisters. But then when I did the poll in our group, I got 50 votes. They all came in about a day, and 80% reported that women could vote in their ecclesias, 20% that women could not vote in their ecclesia, and one person said that it wasn't democratic. Some people who were high enough up in like the social hierarchy who were baptized women could vote, and some who were like newly baptized or lower on the social hierarchy could not, even though they were baptized. So it seems like we've actually gone backwards with women's rights in the Christadelphians then at that point, where it's more restricted than when it was first set up.
That wouldn't surprise me, again, because he wasn't capturing it as part of the first principles. So it's a little bit of history that no one's really checking on. They're just sort of doing it by gut, these things that aren't specifically prescribed. So that, that doesn't surprise me. And, I was even thinking about how, even again, since, I think there are sort of waves of even like where things become more conservative or more liberal. I think lately it almost seems like the Christadelphians in some ways have become more conservative. I think about like Halloween or Christmas. Like when I was a kid, we were, Christadelphians, and we celebrated Halloween and Christmas, never thought about it. There was Santa Claus, there was, we put costumes on, whatever. Whereas I think there are some ecclesias who have specifically said they don't do that. They don't think it's a good idea, that sort of, and like homeschooling's always been around, but I think the sort of idea of Christadelphian homeschooling, as more and more of the schools, I guess, have become available, I think there is sort of a conservatism that exists now that didn't necessarily exist, when I was a kid.
Yeah, and I don't think it's even just in Christadelphia, but it's definitely also in Christadelphia where I see that. And yeah, I do know people who are like that. I actually went through that where my family decided they're going to be more religious and stop celebrating Christmas midway through
Right.
elementary school. So that was super
Oh,
fun.
no way.
Yep.
Wow,
One year you had a tree,
sorry.
next year you didn't.
Sorry.
Yeah.
How long did that last? Was that the rest of your childhood, or was it like a 1-year thing?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story now. So that means I won't do it when we talk again next time. But let me tell you.
Okay.
So my mom decided when I was in 3rd grade that we were not going to celebrate Christmas anymore. Done. She just made a decision for everyone. So I remember going to school and all the kids being like, "What do you celebrate?" I was like, "I don't celebrate Christmas." They're like, "Well, do you celebrate Hanukkah?" And I was like, "No." They're like, "Do you celebrate Kwanzaa?" And I was like, "No." But they just couldn't wrap their minds around it. My mom decided to rebrand it as Love Day.
Oh,
And I
man.
was like, I'm not fucking telling my other classmates that. Like, I am not saying that. Sounds weirder. That sounds way worse. But she was like trying to be like, well, I'll still get you gifts because I feel bad, but it's going to be like only like polar bear, penguin, like themed wrapping paper and not like red. Like it was
Oh,
weird.
wow.
She was trying so hard to walk that line of like not destroying our childhoods and making us feel like she just suddenly didn't love us. But it was even weirder. So we, to get back to your question, we did not celebrate again. So that was when I was in 3rd grade. I don't think we started celebrating again until I was in maybe 9th or 10th grade, because by then
Oh, wow.
my brother got a job at a hardware store and just bought a tree one day at work because they sell them there just on the lot, and brought one home and installed it when no one was home, and got the lights from the attic. He found the old ornaments. My mom had thrown them away. She just like hidden them in the back of the attic. So he just did it, and she was like, all right, like I guess we have a tree this year. She just brought Christmas the fuck back. He started decorating the outside of the house. They started calling it Christmas again. All of a sudden we celebrated Christmas again. I was like, okay, weird.
Wow.
There's still another plot
weird.
twist. My brother went on to love Christmas. He got a Santa suit. He got the woman he was seeing at that time, like a Mrs. Claus suit. So they were like super into it.
Whoa.
It was wild. That relationship eventually did not work out. He ended up seeing someone else who he ended up with. That person was a Christadelphian who didn't celebrate Christmas. It came full circle. She made him give up Christmas. He got rid of everything.
No
He got rid of the Santa
way.
suit. He won't celebrate. It was his favorite holiday. He brought it back to our family. He loved it. And now, again, the second loss of Christmas just yanked out from under him. And
That is wild.
That kind of breaks my heart.
I couldn't believe it. He loved it so much. And I was like, that was like his favorite thing in the world. Like he loved it. He would be buying ornaments all the time. He was so excited about wearing his costume. He would wear a Santa hat, and he was on the Jumbotron at sports arenas because he had a big red beard. People thought he looked like young Saint Nick. And he would be on the Jumbotron. He would always wear the hats. People thought he looked like super Christmassy with the beard. It was crazy. And then one other super weird thing that I guess I'll mention here because we're talking about the holidays is there's another family in our ecclesia who I kind of like to say it like the old Grinch movie, how the Grinch stole Christmas. She stole Hanukkah. She just decided that their family was going to celebrate Hanukkah now. They couldn't celebrate Christmas, but she was just like, we're going to steal a Jewish holiday. That's going to be better than be a Christian holiday. I was like, how is that better? Like, what is going on here? This ecclesia was just such a disaster. I grew up in around Christmas and the winter holidays. Like, one family's lighting their menorah, another family's got freaking Love Day, another family's celebrating a normal Christmas, and like Santa's showing up with a sack. I remember my cousin from another family, Heather, you would know from the second Tudum family, if you know which one I'm referring to, the brother and who never got baptized. So the son, I'll just say, because he wasn't technically a brother. I remember him showing up with a sack, and I got Pop-Tarts from his sack. He's like, you've been a good girl. You can take one from my sack. And he just like would show up at all the houses of all the Christadelphians like as Santa. So I was like, there was just so much chaos around that topic in my ecclesia. There was just nothing stable, and no one could figure it out because it's like, it's a
Yes.
cultural tradition. It's an American tradition more than
Mhm.
anything else, I think. The Hanukkah one is very much Jewish, so I don't know. Like that one is a little bit American, but very Jewish American. So I don't know what was going on. I don't know their reasoning. I don't know what conversations were happening that I was not a part of, but I saw
That's
every
right.
variety of holiday
It's
Christadelphian.
exactly what happens. The culture is sort of informing, Christadelphians don't like to think that they're influenced by the outside culture, but of course they are. So,
Mhm.
Yes,
so
the
what they're
world.
trying,
The world's evil,
they're
so can't have these
informing
evil
themselves
holidays.
through other conservative Christian groups, I think, especially, and I think that is
Yeah.
increasingly true. I mean, I have family members who
Mhm.
love to watch, other, because they want more conservative Christian material than necessarily they can get from the Christadelphians. So they're like, well, what's on YouTube? What's
Mhm.
out there in the
Yeah.
podcast world? And as long as it's clean,
Oh yeah, and like the
then why not
music, the
draw from
Christian
that?
music,
Yeah.
because it's
As long as it's
godlier
not too
than the stuff
Trinitarian,
on the
then it's
radio.
fine. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Totally
exactly.
fine.
Because then look at
And
math.
so, for them, and that's, entertainment, and it's, clean, and, it does make sense, but then it does end up influencing the culture of the Christadelphians, whether they realize it or not.
Yeah, and they can't figure it out. Clearly, they're struggling to figure out what they believe. Should we put the Christ back in Christmas or
tough.
no?
It's tough because,
We should do another Facebook poll. We'll be like, were you allowed to celebrate Christmas? Was Christmas around
Yeah,
where you
right.
were? And just figure it out. Because I have no idea what that
that
experience was
does
like for
sound
other people.
chaotic.
Mine was
Yeah,
chaos.
that is really wild.
Yeah. Year to year, I have no idea what we're celebrating. My parents will be celebrating Hanukkah this year, and I'd be like, okay, why not? Like, who knows?
Well, I remember my grandmother moved to Canada when I was 9, and she told us that there were people up there in her, I don't know if it was in her ecclesia or in like another one, but they would put their Christmas tree on wheels so that they could put it away if people were coming over that
Why?
didn't celebrate Christmas. They could like keep it on the down low, right? So they'd be like, put the tree.
This
Yeah.
feels like a sitcom. This feels like literally a premise for a sitcom. Someone's gonna like run away with the tree, and then they walk in that room, and they're like, "Oh, gotta go to the other room."
Put the tree away.
Like,
Yeah, they're like, who's coming over tonight? We gotta
like
hide
the
the tree.
Flintstones. Unplug it. What if they drive by? Heather, do you want to kick us off with talking about the first of our 5 topics that Amy pointed out in her thesis? She wrote that there's the big 5 requirements really for women in Christadelphia. So do you want to go off with the first one?
The quote is, if you were to go to a Christadelphian meeting for the first time, would you expect to find weird rituals, drugs, brainwashing, orgies, or suicidal pacts? Sorry to disappoint, but what you're likely to notice first is hats.
And that was written by a Christadelphian, which was really funny.
Yeah. I mean, it was a big deal, I remember,
We've already talked about it in your
yeah,
episode.
we talked about it, yeah.
That when you get your first head covering, what you choose for your head coverings, all of that stuff. What I really liked about this when I started thinking about it was that what would you say would be in common? Like if you're looking for patterns, what are the things in common with all of the things that he listed? Those are all things that cults do.
Mm-hmm.
So this Christadelphian author is like, hey, here's all these things that cults do. And us. I was like, oh, is there something you're trying to say there? I don't even think he realized it because he was going to try to be like, oh, we're so different. But I was like, if you wanted to say like, oh, we're normal, wouldn't you be like, oh, what you wouldn't notice is, would you expect stained glass windows? Would you notice incense? Would you notice candles? Like things that you would see like a Catholic place or maybe like a Presbyterian or like these other types of churches, Unitarian, whatever. Instead, he was just like went right into cults and was like, hey, let's start comparing us with cults. And I was like, are you trying to show that you're different, or are you lumping yourself in and being like, well, instead of suicide pacts, we picked hats? Like we had a conversation. Like, what should we pick? We don't like Kool-Aid. We're gonna go with hats.
We're
Every
weird.
woman.
We're this weird tiny little group, but what makes us special is
hats.
Yeah.
I just thought it was a funny quote.
That is funny. And it's true because when I've told people that I used to be part of an obscure Christian religion, they're always like so excited because they're like, tell me, like, what was it like? What did you do? And they expect something like really scandalous, and I'm like, I don't know, we were just kind of boring.
I would say if they are a cult or someone to classify them as such, they are potentially one of the most boring. So,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, most of the time I'm just reading the Bible. There's not a lot that's gonna be too wild with that. What's wild is what people do with their Bibles in the Christadelphian Facebook group. I will tell you, those threads are wild.
Yeah.
But people just reading the Bible, not so much.
No.
Amy, why don't you tell us what kind of head coverings did you wear? What was some of your thought on this?
What I remember the most is, well, I mean, I think for a while people would wear actual, straw hats. And then I think then people discovered those little lace mantillas or whatever, that how convenient those were, that you could just stuff them into your Bible case and always have them handy, so you didn't have to like forget. Because if you got to, meeting and you didn't have your hat, you were like, oh my, I remember one woman actually forgot hers and she like put a Kleenex on her head. Like
I have seen napkins on the head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, oh, that's so funny. I thought that was so weird and odd, but you're both being like, yep.
No,
we've seen it. We've just been around Christadelphians enough. And like Heather pointed out, like if you're at a different ecclesia where they wear it more often, you might be caught unprepared. If you're at like a Bible school or something where you're out of your regular routine as well, where it's like, oh, I didn't think we needed one for the Bible readings, or I didn't get to go back to my room to get my Bible before, the evening program or whatever it was. Like you're out of your routine. You don't know when you need one. Time for the napkin.
I mean, I remember actually seeing two women share a head covering once.
What?
And I thought that was weird. She like put her head kind of like on the shoulder of the other girl and just pulled it. It was like the long like lace one. So
that'd be like me and my sister. It'd be like, let's pretend we're conjoined twins.
Conjoined under God.
I mean,
that's like, so crazy.
That tells, the fact that people are putting napkins and Kleenexes on their head.
Yeah.
That's a signal that this is something you don't break that rule without people being like,
and hurting their necks, all leaning together, as Heather pointed out, to try to share a head covering.
I feel like a lightning bolt, like people were afraid a lightning bolt was going to hit.
Right. I was going to say, like, what was going to happen if you didn't have a head covering? Were you really going to be struck from the record, Like,
God won't find your name in the book of life.
It is a shame before God.
Well, it's not even before God. It's just like Aunt Kathy's going to talk shit about me. It's just they know eyes are on them, and if they don't conform, there's going to be so much gossip, and the gossip chain is the brutal part. And that's how they that's how they enforce this. It's not even like someone goes around like checks it or be like, you can't have the bread and wine today. You don't have your hat. It's not like that's explicitly said. It's really like this very quiet enforcement of like someone giving you a dirty look, someone, coming to you afterward. Oh, where was your head covering today?
Yeah. Very
like
powerful.
those are just little barbs, but it's enough to enforce it and cause that kind of erratic behavior.
Yeah, and it's not the men who are doing that. And that's what's always so interesting about power dynamics. And you can save that conversation for another day. But
it really is, women enforcing it on women.
But that's because in any system and if you think about anything about power dynamics, it's that the people who are the most in power don't have to enforce it. It's the people who are one step down who are going to enforce it much harder than, the highest level. The next level down are the enforcers, and then the level beneath that are the people who have no power at all. So the mid-level are the ones who are really going to be the toughest enforcers. I mean, whether you're in the Christadelphians or in any system of power. And so that was very much why the women were people often say, well, women clearly are okay with this because women are the ones, enforcing it. It's like, well, no, it's just how power dynamics works.
Yeah, it really does seem to all come down to power. And it's interesting how there's no point in there where I could really see anyone being empowered and being able to disrupt that system when it's set up that way. Because it's the people who are very much on the top who are unaffected by it, who are the most free to change it if they wanted to. But they're the ones who continue to reiterate that this should be enforced. And so then they have all of these people in the audience who listen and say, oh, I need to enforce this rule. And so they do, and to the next generation and so on. They become these enforcers, even if it doesn't benefit them. They just know that's what I was told. And if I'm going to be obedient, I have to enforce this tradition. Not even, real rule, as we pointed out.
Yeah. That's the thing I have to keep thinking about is sort of this idea of a system. Who's the system benefiting? And a system that you can be in a system that benefits you and it can still be a bad system. Like that's something I've been sort of thinking about lately. The idea of patriarchy, especially in particular, is, it's not good for anybody really, but the people who it benefits don't necessarily notice that it's a bad system because it's very comfortable. So, but those are the ones who benefit from the most, or the ones with the most power, and that's what preserves it. That preserves any system.
Did you guys want to talk a little bit more about clothing and dress in general, like women not being able to wear pants? So, like the differences in genders. So, there's also just what are men allowed to wear versus women, girls versus women. You'd mentioned in your thesis that some women actually described wearing pants as disrespectful. And if you have any stories you want to share about that, this would probably be a good time to talk about some of those topics.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know if that's shifted at all in the past since I wrote that thesis. I don't know if there's more, if people are, because I think as a whole, our society, American society, is more casual than it used to be. I know
Yeah,
I have,
jeans can now be considered dressy, whereas when I was a kid, they were so casual.
yeah. Or there's, like my kids, my kids have wanted to wear pajamas to school more than once, not on pajama day. And I
Yeah.
have to be like, nope, we're not wearing pajamas. You got to actually wear clothes. But there are a lot of kids who do
I
wear pajamas to school.
Yeah, in high school, I see it a lot, that age right now, very casual.
Whereas I'm always like, you can't do that. That's just wrong, But I do remember as a kid, a newer female member of the church who'd been dating someone at the church in the ecclesia, and came wearing pants one Sunday, and
I
everyone was
remember
kind of
that
like,
too.
"Oh, she's wearing pants."
You can tell she's an outsider too, can't you, just from the pants?
Yeah, and it was kind of interesting because she knew she was supposed to wear a skirt, but her grandmother had told her she couldn't go unless she wore pants because it was like -10 degrees that day or something. And so she was just like,
Oh, that's funny. So it was
Yeah.
actually like looking out for her well-being. It wasn't
Right.
like, oh, I want you to be different. It was just, I want to take care of you, make sure that you are safe and warm and
and
dry.
so we're all like, oh, okay, what are you gonna do? You gotta, we understand, kind of thing.
But the first reaction was not understanding, like,
No,
oh, maybe
no.
she's cold. The first thought was not, oh, maybe she's cold.
The first
The
thought
first thought was,
somebody's got to tell her. So you cannot do this. Or does anybody have an extra skirt lying around? Because
yeah, it was,
In
how
your
do we
Bible case?
enforce this?
Yeah.
And she wasn't even a member. She was not baptized, right?
Right.
She was an outsider. And so that is so wild that instead of being hospitable or anything like that, it was very much like, we need to make her conform immediately. That was the gut reaction. I remember that too, because someone that I was friends with who was a baptized brother brought a girlfriend who he later married. So it was a very successful relationship. They were good. Always wore pants when she came. And it was funny because she stuck out like a sore thumb. I never wore pants to meeting, and it was
No.
never explicitly said. I just knew you didn't, and I didn't. I was never bought any. I was not ever encouraged. I never saw it. I don't think I ever saw a woman wear pants to anything that was like a Sunday meeting or similar, where it was very much like a group of women gathering for that. Like maybe on like Thursday night classes, that was more casual.
Right.
So I'm sure people wore them to meeting, just
Yes.
not to the Sunday services, I would say.
No, it was the Sunday services in my ecclesia. It was definitely
Yeah.
Which is kind of wild because you're wearing pants 6 out of 7 days a week.
Oh yeah.
For most people, going to work, going to school, kids playing sports, whatever. You grow up wearing pants nowadays. Back in the day, in the 1800s when this was written, girls actually did wear skirts.
Right.
I literally
Yeah.
Googled it because I was like, am I crazy? But when did they allow women to start wearing pants? Because I thought I remembered somewhere, but I wasn't able to find it.
Like the 30s or 30s.
It was, from what I saw on the
Boomers?
article, it was 1900s, men went off to war, so women started wearing pants to work safely, but it weren't socially acceptable until the 70s, it said.
Oh,
So
wow.
even later than you thought. So they came in early for working women, but it was still, I guess, considered socially, like for women in other areas, like at home, I guess, or in like other settings, they were still expected to wear skirts. I thought it was just like when bikes were invented. I don't know why my brain thought that. I was like, we just really wanted to like be able to do stuff fun. But no, it said like even in the 1800s, which is really the time period where the Christadelphians came to be, it said that women were on average wearing like 15 pounds of skirts.
Wow.
So it was causing impaired breathing, heat stress, risk of falls, risk of being caught in machinery, which again is why they had to wear pants to work, because it could literally kill them. But it was also already slowly killing them and putting incredible amount of stress on them to follow these standards. And again, it's kind of just like what we're talking about today, is that was still enforced on them socially, even though it wasn't like illegal. You would just be known as that girl who wore pants, and like no one would want to marry you kind of thing. Like you'd be socially ostracized for being different.
Well, gender roles are really important because that's how you know what your job is. I mean, it's like, again, it's a marker for this is
Yeah.
what your job is, and this is what your job is. And you don't mix the two up. You don't want to get anywhere in between there, because then it's confusing for people. Make
And
it
there's
very clear.
psychology,
Yeah.
the conformity where people
Yeah.
don't want to stick out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was shocked. It's only been like 50, 60 years that women have really been wearing pants. And the Christadelphians have not caught up.
Yeah. I mean, I think there were probably women, there are always women who probably wore pants and were considered to be like, ooh, rabble rousers, historically before then. But yeah, it wasn't the norm.
If anyone has a photo of a Christadelphian woman wearing pants at a Sunday service, send it in. We want to see it. We want to see it. They exist.
Yeah.
And
Unicorn.
then, I want to see who these badass women are.
I remember when we go to a Bible school or like a CYC weekend, and the paperwork they would send you ahead of time, they usually did have a dress code in there. And it was pretty heavy on like the women, like what women and girls can wear.
The straps on your shoulders and
stuff.
stuff.
The straps and like no reveal, like V-necks or anything that would.
How long the skirt was.
How long the skirts and that kind of thing. But I do remember there also were some rules for the guys, like no muscle shirts and, no shorts during the services. And I don't know, it was a lot more lax for the guys, of course, but
no ties required.
Yeah,
be
or
super
like
casual.
Ties for Sunday morning only.
Yeah. Okay. Very.
Oh yeah, the head covering was usually in the dress code too.
Oh,
if I remember correctly.
That's probably a good thing to do to reduce confusion, because as we've talked about, sometimes there's confusion if people weren't prepared. And there's also cultural differences where some ecclesias are more likely to wear them than others, as you mentioned in your interview episode. So when you were at the Vermont ecclesia, I think it was, you didn't have to wear them as much because you were around independents.
I mean, it was literally just us.
Yeah, so no pressure.
We made our own rules there. Which I guess is why we ended up not being Christadelphian.
Yeah, it didn't work out. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Uh-oh. It's a slippery slope from no head coverings to totally leaving. There you go.
One thing leads to another, yeah.
Yeah. I just remember the gossip. I remember one sister telling my mom that she didn't like how short my dress was. And my mom then telling me, and I was like, wow. And I still have not forgot that. All right, so I think we all kind of covered checking ahead to see if they need to have their head coverings. You had mentioned that in your thesis. And the only other thing I have really noted here is just the hypocrisy of men not having a dress code, which Heather mentioned like a little bit. There was some structure, I guess, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true outside of the Christadelphians. I mean, you think about, many cultures, the women are the ones who have to be very carefully policed in their attire.
They're always the ones controlled. Always the ones have to be obedient, huh?
We're very dangerous. We are very harbingers of destruction.
Of destruction! Yeah. Hey, Heather, do you want to open up the next topic?
Women must be silent at meeting. Dun, dun, dun.
If there's any
Christadelphians enforce women being silent within the church, which usually meant not being allowed to give prayers, not being allowed to read the Bible during the readings, or to give exhortations. And they enforce this by being derisive of women preachers in other groups. So they shame others so that you know that they would shame you if you challenge this. And they told women that it was God's rule, not theirs. So if you challenge it, you're challenging God's authority. So therefore you are sinful or evil. And they claim that women's work is important and stipulate their place in the kitchen and with the children. And then there's a quote from your thesis that says, during a Bible class I went to, it was pointedly said, does any brother have any questions? Which is pretty wild.
They must have had some chatty sisters.
Yeah, maybe.
Or really controlling men, honestly. Who were just like, we're not going to tolerate women existing and having thoughts and opinions.
I mean, I was trying to remember. Honestly, I think I've either forgotten a lot of this or just wasn't paying that much attention in the first place. But I feel like in Morristown and Meriden during Bible class, anything other than the memorial service, I feel like women were allowed to ask questions, but I don't really remember that they did. I don't remember women having much of a voice.
I remember the one woman who criticized my outfit was kind of like, and now I'm just going to refer to her as that from here on. But she was definitely the smart one in the ecclesia in the sense of, oh, I think she would be the one and they'd be like, oh, she's like a walking Bible kind of thing, where she was very obvious in her devotion and commitment to it. And she also, and I wonder if it was all just genuine or part of showing like virtue signaling, she always asked questions. And I remember once even my dad getting upset because I guess he felt that she like, however she had phrased it had upset him. I think maybe she had kind of insulted like the way he had made his topic or whatever, and so he got really upset. And it wasn't like as a sister, he just like his feelings were hurt because he's sensitive. you know but it was wild because she would ask some sharp questions. It was clear that she was smart, whatever her intentions were, presumably genuine of just wanting to learn. But it was interesting because I always saw a woman speaking and it was generally her. But she was also like the biggest enforcer, so I'm like, it was always interesting because I even remember her talking about her relationship with her husband at one point. I don't remember if it was a sister's specific class or something. It might have been, but of saying like, oh, I know that I'm supposed to be submissive to him. So when we have discussions, he has the final say, but I always get to share what I feel, kind of thing. And I was like, you don't seem like a very submissive woman. Like, here you are asking all these questions. My dad wants to like go home and cry because you're like hounding him after he just gave a talk and he's still at the platform. Like, what do you want from me? I was like, it feels like you want power or are trying to claim as much power as you can here. Like, watching her always felt like someone trying to walk that line where she was clearly someone who was competent and sharp and outspoken. And she's like, oh yeah, I'm also submissive. I'm like, are you? I don't know, but I always saw her asking questions.
I feel like I know who you're talking about based on
Yeah,
your
you know who I'm talking
Okay.
about. We're not going to name names, but because you went to Morristown, you know who I'm talking about. Yes.
Just so interesting because this is the one element of how women are treated within the church that could be doctrinally like shifted, because there were prophets, women who spoke prophecy in the Old Testament,
and who led freaking armies.
Yes.
Like, I think she talked to her armies to help lead them.
So it's not like someone couldn't make an argument for that, but it is just so culturally ingrained. I really don't think, although I do think there are ecclesias that do allow women to speak more. Again, they're the unicorns that are sort of mythical.
Yes, I heard about those in Australia. So that would be the only ones any of us I think are aware of women exhorting.
Yeah,
it's just like potentially like one or two in Australia. So, and not all of us being in North America based, we've never seen that.
But that silence is, I think, for me personally, was really what drove me out. Everyone has their own. It would be really interesting at some point for everyone to say what is their explicit thing that they think really drove them away,
like the top one issue.
And that was for me. Whereas I have, I can talk about 5 different people and they could share their sort of one top issue, and it would be completely different. But for me, that was just so frustrating. But I do think what I did talk about in my thesis, and I still see more of, is this idea that women do find places where they can speak, even if they can't officially speak. And again, this is true across conservative Christian churches, is that women find places of power outside where they can kind of use their voice, or they can use their influence indirectly, since they can't use it directly. It's kind of a way to kind of work underneath this, work around the system.
Yeah, the subversion. One, and I put that at the end of something we can talk about is, what choices do they really have in the end? And that's one of them, is you can stay, but try to find your power within it. And it kind of made me think of My Big Fat Greek Wedding, if you've seen that movie. It's an older one, so now it's a very dated reference, but the wife of the like patriarch of the family says, the women are the neck. The man is the head of the family. The woman is the neck who turns the head in different directions and tells it where to look.
Yeah.
And so she talks about really that control. So it's like she makes the figurehead of the father almost symbolic, where she's really the one making everything happen. And so that was interesting. I feel like that was kind of what some of the Christadelphian women seem to be saying, is like, oh yeah, he is the vote in the family. He's the AB. But guess who he talks about what he's going to be doing on the AB committee with? He knows what we are doing. Like, we're on the same page. So I think a lot of women hold power behind closed doors, potentially.
All right, so this is point number 3, which is women are, quote, exhorted to be vigilant students of the word of God, just like men, but informed they must not let anything come of those efforts. So basically, we should be very familiar with the Word of God, but we can't really do anything with it.
You can teach the children. You can teach the children.
Teach the children.
Thank you, Amy. Now we know
Yeah.
our options. Yeah, I felt like that was just silly. And I think that was one of the things that was pushing me away. Not the reason I left, but I think that was something that always kind of bothered me, even if I didn't talk about it, was that I was like, what's the point of reading this? I'd be like, oh, this could be a good topic for a for like an exhortation. And I'd start talking about it. And I remember at one point I was dating someone within the community. And I told him, I was like, oh, I think this would be a good exhortation topic. He's like, I come up with my own topics. So I was like, I literally have no outlet for this. There's nothing I can do with this. What's the point? Like, nothing is so discouraging as something like that. Because
Yeah.
even, potentially be like, oh, if I can't write, like, we could look into it together and he could, do an exhortation. No, nothing.
He wasn't going to let you be his neck.
I got nothing. I was not going to be the neck in that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I took it kind of as like a pass that I didn't really have to worry about it so much. I was like, well, if nobody's going to ask me these questions, then why do I bother? I'll read some other things instead.
Yeah, I feel like it almost discourages you from being involved. Yeah.
Yeah, it did. But I do remember in my CYC, I feel like maybe this was junior CYC, like before I got baptized, but I feel like I remember us taking turns giving like a little class. And I know I definitely did them. So I don't know if that was just us being like extremely liberal in Morristown at that time or what, because I do remember having to prepare a class and give it.
Yeah, I was also in Morristown and I never had that. I remember one of the older male cousins that I had ran it for a while, and then after that, the husbands that one of my cousins married into, then he was running it for a while. And so it was always just like one brother basically running it, but like on the younger side, like, kind of like when it's like you have the cool new teacher at school, like the substitute, like always that age, like, oh yeah, like it's CYC, but fun.
Yeah, I think mine was probably like that because my parents were the ones running it at that point.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't even know how much older I am than you, but you were like a little tiny kid when I left, I think, so we didn't really overlap.
Probably. No, not really. Like I knew your name, but I had no memories of you because again, both of my parents were the youngest in their family and I was the youngest of their kids. So there's a generational gap there for sure. I was so much on the younger end.
And Heather, I think I'm older than you, so I think we're covering the gambit here.
Well, that's fine. It's better to have a diversity of voices because even we both went to the same ecclesia when we were in CYC, Heather, and we both had different experiences with that. So even that's interesting how just within like a generation or so that changed.
Right. Yeah, and Amy, I remember you at Shippensburg and stuff. Like, I remember looking up to you because you were like a cool teenager when I was a kid. I was like, I want to be like her.
Aww.
Yeah, it was funny how culturally the teenagers, I remember that even for me, like when I was younger, like the teenagers were so cool. And now I'm like, that was a big fish in a small pond.
Yeah.
Like I can only imagine other people looking at us and being like, look at these lame, like religious kids. It's so funny now thinking about it.
Yeah, like the people that work in like the cafeteria at Shippensburg are probably looking at us like, these people are so weird.
Yeah.
We loved it though, I have to say.
Yes, yeah, we did.
The next one of the 5 was submission and service. So it then kind of listed that the roles for women could be for cooking, teaching children under 12, which again, as Heather learned, the age of baptism, women cannot teach, cleaning, playing the piano or organ, because again, musical instruments are generally pretty much confined to that, as well as ordering books and managing the library, which I would say these are pretty much the only things I ever saw as well. Yeah. The women would be downstairs prepping the luncheon for after the service. They would be Sunday school teachers that I had. Some men were involved with the cleaning, and I actually do have a story about that. At one point, there was like apparently some brother, and this was while I was there, but it was so long ago, I don't really remember, and I don't think I was there for that. It may have been like in an AB meeting or something, but he had made some comment about the women cleaning the toilets. And apparently my dad got furious. And so the next time we went to clean, and our cleaning was set up on schedule and it was divided by family. So I was signed up to go with my parents. And I think maybe my sister was still going, the one who was baptized. So she would have been like on our family's cleaning committee. We went in there and he says, you do upstairs. I'm doing the bathrooms. And he specifically delegated himself to do that, like right after this scandal happened. And I was shocked because I was like, that was fucking feminist. My dad was willing to take action to show that he respected not just me, but women in general, women in the ecclesia, and that we were not to be doing that labor, the lowest ranking thing, and to be talked to disrespectfully. He was so fucking humble. And I do admire that my dad did that. I have not forgotten that. He was like, I'm doing that, So there are a few there where there was not all just women cleaning. So that was one example. But it was always, and we had one brother who played the piano, and he was fantastic, and he was a doctor. So I was like, oh my God. I was like, what is going on with him? We were all very impressed because that's not usually what you see. And then my grandma loved doing the library. She was always on top of that. So I don't know of any men doing that. I just remember it was a passion project for my grandma. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember in Bucks County, it was a man that did the recording, and at Bible school and stuff, it was usually like a team of men that did it. But
I think for the tech stuff, it was a lot of men because my grandma used to do that. And then we had one of the people move in who had like a tech background. So as she got older, he kind of took over and it became men recording it.
I was just thinking about how like the silence in the meeting and the not being on the podium and these sort of jobs, they all kind of are part of the same package of women. The sort of very specific gender roles, the split of the roles is very prescribed.
Yeah. You basically just have a list. Here's the list of what you can't do. Here's the list of what you can do. Men, here's your list. What you can do, what you can't do. But even with that, I feel like there's not what can't they do? Like they could do any of this stuff. They can teach children to shop. They can help with the cooking. They can help with the cleaning, playing piano, library,
Strangely,
recording.
it was the exception, not the rule, though, for them to do that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, because these are all sort of serving roles, so it's like, why would we want to do that unless you love cooking, or cleaning?
The playing of the piano even was the exception, not the rule. I mean, it was sort of like, well, why would you do that if you can be up on the stage and telling everybody else what to do?
Right.
Yeah, if you have that power, why would you want to come down to such a humbled position? It's not like, what are you going to do? Act like Jesus and wash our feet? Like, come on.
Come on. No, I mean,
they're not going to.
I truly don't think they've probably given it much thought, but that's also, I think, true. And
I also wonder if they're just like, well, the women have so little to do, let them have this.
Maybe.
You almost wonder, like, or I'm so busy doing all this stuff, I don't want to also take on that.
Right.
I don't know. Because, like, I know before this episode comes out, I'll have my interview with Rob out, which I just recorded last night. And he was talking about, like, multiple nights a week he was teaching. And then he had the Bible, like, business that they had where it was open every day. And so he was helping with that, teaching classes. And I was like, oh my God, that's a lot of work. So I kind of get it where he's like, I don't feel like coordinating a lunch when I'm giving the talk at the lunch.
No, I mean, structure makes sense. I mean, but the problem isn't the structure. The problem is not being able to move, like, when people aren't, maybe, the thing that I think is just such a shame about that whole package of silence in the meeting, not being able to participate, on the podium, is just half of your population is just not able to contribute to any of the thinking or the scholarship or the inspiration of others in any way other than this very sort of narrowly focused way. It's just such a waste of opportunity.
Yeah, it really is. And you think about the lack of voices that they're just never going to hear, because they talk about their experiences. I still remember my brother's first exhortation, and I was always surprised because he was not a public speaker, not a reader, not a writer, but because he was a man, he got pushed towards it. And I remember him starting with a story that I'd never heard before that he shared. But it was interesting because you hear about life from their perspective and the things that they relate to in the Bible. And I feel like they're not going to relate to like the story of Ruth as much as a woman would, And so they can talk about it and be like, yeah, she reminds me of my wife, like you're never going to have that same level of connection. You're never going to have people who reflect your experience as much and things that are as relevant to you when you're never giving them a voice. It's really sad, honestly, when you think about it that way. Because like for a while I was following a podcast and their whole thing was about reading books written by women because they realized that most bookshelves you would look at, more than half of the books that were being like taught in classrooms and schools and in most environments, the books that were, being pushed as being sold as classics, all this stuff tended to be written by men. And so they always had this advantage, and their voices were always heard over women who are half the population. So they tried to highlight books by women to counterbalance that. And I feel like if you look at exhortations, like how many are really talking about experiences that are equal, across genders? Ideally, most of them are kind of gender neutral, where it's like, oh, we should all pray more. Like, okay, sure, that's gender neutral. But how many are talking more, really everything's about the male experience?
I mean, I don't want to go down too far of a rabbit hole, but representation, like we talk about,
Yeah,
representation matters.
exactly.
Like the first time I heard a female CEO speak, I was like, oh, and she was kind of more my age. And I was like, I could do that. Like just the fact that we've never had a female president of the United States,
Yep.
it's like, no, you don't even realize that you can do things until you see someone who's doing it. And you're like, you just take that so for granted.
It makes a difference.
It's so powerful. And just like, whether it's books or art or movies, these are all mostly written by men and about men or created by men. And so I don't know if either of you heard of the Bechdel test?
Yes. So it's with movies and books and stuff, it's whether women talks to another woman without it being about a man, right?
For more than 2 minutes in a movie.
Okay, for more than 2 minutes. Okay.
And it is so rare. It's like 5%. Like it's like this tiny percentage.
Unbelievable.
And I think the original concept was around movies. Like, is the movie pass the Bechdel test? But lately I've been thinking about it with books, and I'm like, do two women talk to each other about something other than men for more than 2 minutes in this book? And it's shocking, like how rare that even in books, I'm like, even in books like I read regularly, like it isn't what the kind of things that are mostly in our cultural norms.
Yeah, and that's so sad because it's just shrinking women's lives again and their interests and all of that. It's all about the men. Always got to focus on the men.
Well, it is our culture.
Yeah, it really is. And that's a great example of a way to continue to see it, because sometimes you're so ingrained in it. Like you said, representation matters. Sometimes you're so used to seeing things one way that you don't even realize it's a problem. So if for anyone who hasn't heard of the Bechdel test, that's a great one to keep in mind and just kind of look for.
It changed the way I think so much. It just really kind of turns things over in your head.
Well, I think that's a great segue to our last topic, which I feel like goes kind of broadly feminism, but how being mothers is encouraged, how careers are discouraged, and how feminism in general is discouraged in Christadelphian spaces. And it seems like, again, it may be getting more conservative because Robert Roberts' wife even was writing a book and articles. Dr. Thomas had a daughter, and she was also a published author on theology. So even though they weren't speaking, as we've talked about, they were writing, they were expressing themselves, and they were given platforms to do so. And possibly, again, because they were so close to power, because Thomas and Roberts were the most influential figures. But that was pretty crazy.
And
So
it's changed. Yeah, it's gotten more narrow and more confined. I mean, I think there are books that have been published by Christadelphians women, but they are about women's issues. They're not theology. You will not see that.
Yeah, I think Thomas's were theology. I think a lot of Robert's wives were more women's stuff, but I think she was undeniably well read about the Bible and theology as well. So I would have to look into it to see if she had written other stuff. I think her articles probably would have been theology as well.
I think I had one of her books, and it was like one of those books that I like wanted to read to be a good sister, but I could not swallow it, like, because it was obviously very old fashioned.
That doesn't help, no.
Yeah, but it was very much like, talking about a woman's role in the relationship and in the church and as a mother and all that, and I was just like, oh.
Submit to your husband.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, there's one quote from your thesis that said, "There's temptation to follow modern women in choosing an exciting career. The effect is seen not only in the world, but fundamentally within our ecclesial life. Furthermore, it is not without cause that the percentage of Christadelphian children accepting the privilege of life in Christ is seriously declining." So that's fun, where it's basically like feminism is causing our children to not stay Christadelphians.
Yeah.
So the fault is all on the women, obviously.
Yeah, and again, 25 years after I wrote all of that, I don't think a whole lot has changed there. I do, although that survey was interesting, Zinnia, because it had, it did ask what percentage of women, they did share something
Yeah.
like, was it like 60-40? I don't remember what
So I have it actually right here. Yeah, it was right around this part of the thesis. I thought it'd be good to talk about it. But so the article we were discussing is from the Tidings. They, in February of 2024, did a survey that they published in their May issue, which we'll be linking in the show notes. So I'll just read their findings. It said that one data set that may surprise older brothers and sisters is the number of mothers with outside jobs. Among the respondents of our survey, 40% identified as full-time homemakers, 36% have a part-time job, and 24% have full-time paid employment. These data seem in line with more significant trends, but may represent a change from what previous generations expected regarding stay-at-home moms in the ecclesias.
Yeah, and so it sounds like it's kind of almost 50-50, 50 stay-at-home, 50 with some sort of job, whether part-time or full-time.
To me, it's surprising that 40% of them are still full-time homemakers, just because in society, I don't think that number is anywhere near that. And I'm like, how
Yeah.
are Christadelphians actually financially more well off than other populations, or are they just living like super frugally? How's that
Or
happening?
generations. This is not split across generations. I think if you had millennials versus Gen X versus boomers,
Oh,
I
Yeah.
think you would see the proportion of each generation is different. Because I
okay.
know among all of my friends, every woman I know is working full time or as much as they can.
Mhm.
Um, and then beyond that, I think I've seen just like with older people that I know and the people who like retired and all, a lot of them were able to be stay-at-home mothers. And when you look at inflation rates and things like that, their dollars went further. They had
Mhm.
less expenses with like college level education, things like that. Home prices were lower and increased in value a lot more throughout their lifetime if they had purchased a home earlier in their life, so they have higher assets. So I could see that being a generational thing is my theory. But again, they didn't release actual data.
I
So I
know.
Yeah.
can't see it and they didn't break it down that way.
It would have been great to see the data. I was kind of like,
Mhm.
but where's the data?
I know. I was scrolling through to see more
Yeah.
information, but
They cherry picked a few statistics and were like, these are the ones we're going to highlight. And I was like, okay, but did you even think about analyzing it these other ways? Because like
Yeah.
we already have questions.
I've
yeah.
had so many questions after I read that. I mean, I was impressed that they did it, and I seemed like they tried to go about it in like somewhat of an informed manner. It didn't seem like they
Yeah.
just really did it willy-nilly. But at the same time, I was like, but what about this? And what, like, yeah, it was
Yeah.
really hard to just stop there and just be like, is that it?
Yeah, it was kind of frustrating, I guess, because you want more answers from the data. They went through the effort of doing this.
Yeah, and the only one they really kind of gave you a breakout one was on like ideas for what they could do for moms who are frustrated or moms who, want to have a little bit more engagement.
Not women, the moms.
Well,
Yeah, just the moms.
I know that was such a bummer.
Which,
I was like,
I mean, I guess it's nice that they're paying attention to moms. But again, like on this episode on women, it's like, okay, but what about your single women?
yeah.
What about them? What do they need?
They need to find a husband and have kids.
Yeah,
Or if you
Heather.
don't have kids, it's like you just don't
Yeah.
really count in any way whatsoever. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
you just
doesn't it?
really don't exist.
It
It's
Right.
such a bummer.
reinforces
It's
that.
just like, really, come on, people. We are not in
Yeah.
1870.
If you don't have kids, you're not even worth us surveying.
Yeah. Just play the piano and clean the chapel.
Yeah.
So, but I thought it was so interesting that they were doing it, and the idea of sort of pulling out a group and devoting sort of to this topic of a time in people's lives. Like, I mean, I think they were sort of trying to focus on people, especially with younger kids, because obviously, I mean, as your kids get older, they're more independent. And so my sense was that it was really a focus on sort of people with young families and
Yeah,
how,
they talked about like cry rooms and stuff. So people with
yeah,
babies.
and how they, since, you're taking care of your kids, you can't necessarily be as involved or engaged in the services, and how is there other ways we can help you? Or, and it was funny, they had some suggestions. Women can come to your house, and everyone was like, no, I do not want that.
Yeah, that was at the bottom of the list. They're like, we don't want you cleaning our house.
No, thank you.
Yes, do not come to my house. But yeah, I was kind of fascinated that was what they were really honing in on. And I think they were trying to be solution focused. But it also was very much, these are the solutions that are possible, where it seemed like there was probably a whole world of solutions that may have been handwritten in or something, but we don't know. And
yeah. Or you could leave the Christadelphians, solve a few problems.
Yeah, but and these women though, when you have little kids, that's probably not going to happen.
No, and I mean, that's
Yeah,
their
not that
community,
time.
some social supports, potentially a lot of family where it's like, okay, grandma and grandpa will watch you downstairs while I go upstairs.
What's funny, I go to a Unitarian church here in the town I live in, and this it's pretty standard, I think, for mainline Christian churches to have the adults upstairs in the service, and anyone who's basically teenager or younger is downstairs having Sunday school during the service, which is not the Christadelphian norm at
Okay.
all. And then
Yeah, kids are always
so there are people
upstairs.
who are volunteers or whoever downstairs, but the adults, even those with kids, their kids are downstairs being taught by others, so they can kind of just focus, in theory, on the service. And there's sort of a rotation of who's going to be upstairs and downstairs. But I think I've mentioned this at some point to my family, and they were always very dismissive because they were like, "Well, kids need to be in the services," and I think there is a I
I played with toys, so
Yeah,
no.
me too. And
yeah, we
red.
were not into it. Yeah, I don't think we got much out of it, just as former Christadelphian kids.
I mean, what I remember is you learn to sit very, very quietly for long periods of time and entertain yourself. I mean, maybe that's a good skill, but yeah.
I think that's a great point. It sounds very. I mean, for a lot of Christadelphians, they've never been to any other ecclesias. They've never seen another way it could be. You're born into it, and you're never allowed to go to another meeting because they're all wrong. They're all in
Oh
the
yeah.
world. So it's interesting that you share, like, oh yeah, other people have had this problem and figured it out, and they found a way that works better and seems more effective for both groups. So I really appreciate you sharing that. It's kind of funny because again, they're only able to look within their group for a solution, and it's funny to see like, oh yeah, other people have found things that work better.
Yeah, it's just again, it's just culture, and I think I don't see it being a solution that anyone's going to take up anytime soon, just because again, it's just not how we do it.
Yeah, but it's interesting. Yeah, it's not the traditional way, but I appreciate you sharing that you've seen something else and it's worth
Yeah.
listening to. Um, but yeah, I think it also comes from you taking that experience of being somewhere else. So I doubt it would ever change too. I agree with you.
But in the same frame, and maybe you already had this as a topic, is this idea of enclaves of support, this sort of these subgroups that people form. And they even talk about this in that survey. Maybe there could be a moms group or whatever. And I think that's already probably exists in many forms in many of the ecclesias. And I think
Yeah, women's
the
groups.
women's groups in general, I think, were kind of newer in the 90s when I was writing this, and then I think have become more and more a standard part of it. I don't think I remember there always being a sisters' tea at Bible schools, but I don't remember as a
Yeah.
kid there being like a regular sisters group. And now my mom will talk about the sisters group she goes to, and she looks forward to it. And it's just a different way to talk to people in your church, and it's an opportunity to connect around things that your are of concern to you, and it's a little bit more probably casual, and it's just it does provide those opportunities for women to connect about those issues that they're not normally hearing addressed. And sometimes sometimes it's casual and they're like working on, I don't know, crafts, and other times it's more formal where they're talking about Ruth and they're talking about women of the Bible, or topics that they bring up, and the idea is that I guess that they're teaching them, although I think I have heard they have to open and close with a brother comes in and prays and then leaves, or something like that. Or sometimes they'll pray themselves, but sometimes they have the brother kind of set the stage. I don't know. I
Just pre-record and hit play.
Yeah.
Is that?
So it's kind of so they're trying to do it right, but at the same time, just doing that in itself is a nod to some element of feminism, of this consciousness arising that women need to be able to talk to each other.
Yeah.
They would never call
There's
it
a
that.
social impact.
Yeah.
Yeah, they wouldn't call it that, but I think that's likely a side effect. I never liked those. I remember they had those, but I mean, if you think about it on one way, it's always outside of like the memorial
Yeah.
service. It's always
That's true.
very separate. So it becomes an extra chore to coordinate and plan and schedule and set up and whatever else they have to do, which kind of makes it more of like almost a burden. Um, and also, if women are the enforcers of all these roles, I always felt like it wasn't really a safe space to talk because these are the women who are going to report you, basically, who are going to talk about you behind your back. Um, so I didn't find that it was a good environment for women because you couldn't be honest and vulnerable. And so if you were having a hard time with your relationship, it wasn't like a friend in the world who'd be like, oh, like you should leave him and call services and like find support or like find a therapist, like whatever you need, depending on how severe the situation is. Like he could be hitting you and they'd be like, well, you can't get divorced. And it's just like, what are you going to do? And they're not going to be like, call the police. Like, you don't do that either in Christadelphia. Like, you don't involve police, legal stuff. Like, you don't do any of that stuff. So it's like, what would be the point of being like, oh, we're having this struggle with something? Like, they have no solutions. And they're the ones who are most likely going to make it worse if they, talk about it and it's not a closed space. So I just see so many issues with it just from my experiences and just kind of thoughts about having been there. I think the sentiment's good, and I think a lot of them are more just educational focused, so you don't have that problem, like I said, of like the vulnerability of talking about issues you're having. Um, but at the same point, for me, it's like, what's the point at that point? I just, is it just supposed to be an outlet for the exhortations you can't give? Because at that point, it's just like sad. It's like, what are you doing? If you really want to stay, I guess you can do that, so it feels like you're doing something, but
Yeah, and I never went to any of them because I left in my early 20s, so maybe and they were still so new then, I never really experienced them. But I
yeah.
see, when I heard about them, I think I did have a sense of like, oh, that sounds so nice. But you're sort of reminding me that it would still be kind of annoying.
Yeah, I never enjoyed it. I remember going to one or two, and I was just, it always felt like a chore, and it didn't. I've been in a lot of women's spaces that I've enjoyed. That was not a women's space that I enjoyed. I don't think it was well structured, maybe, just the premise of it.
Yeah, I always felt like it was almost like women, almost like children, like playing like
Well,
grown up
women
or something.
are just grown
Well,
children.
yeah,
Did
like
you
I
not
guess
know?
it always felt like sort of weird because they're so used to having,
A man
well,
there.
at that time I was so used to having a man in front of us, and if it was a woman, it just felt, to me, it felt really weird. And I don't know if that was also like internalized misogyny that I had going on as well, because I feel like I had a lot of that as a Christadelphian. And maybe that was it, because I was like, well, she's not going to be as good as a brother would be,
Maybe.
and
Yeah.
yeah, it always felt awkward to me.
Well, it's
But
also no one knows what they're doing, and I think there's even the fear of like they're kind of defying the Christadelphian tradition, so they kind of have to like make all the men leave and close and lock the doors in order to even do that.
right.
And so when you think about it, how comfortable are they going to be operating this when they have very little experience? There's a lot of pressure on them, and they're already kind of pushing the envelope a little bit with the whole thing.
Hmm.
Like, I could see them not being their best as a place where they've seen role models of women at the podium and they know the structure, and you've got people in positions of power, and if there's a problem, everyone knows who they can talk to and be like, hey, we have a question for you. There's no hierarchy, there's no training. Like, I could see it being a difficult thing for everyone, where they don't know what they're doing and they're like, okay, like, what can I say? Like, I don't even know how to behave here, I don't know what's allowed here. It's kind of uncharted territories.
I could see generationally it can also being tricky. Like I could see the older sisters finding it more appealing than the younger sisters. Like the older sisters, it's like their one opportunity to actually kind of, say some of the things or discuss some of the things they've been wanting to talk about, and the younger sisters being like, oh, this is annoying, kind
I
of
could
like,
see it going the other way, actually, too, of like younger sisters being like, oh, I just found out, my sister who left is gay and I want to talk about it and that I still love her. And then the older sisters being like, well, that's not allowed, so don't talk about it. Like, that's bad. I do wonder, like, would they be more likely to shut things down and be like, this way we've always done it,
yeah,
let's not talk about anything new? Because I feel like I have seen like Facebook groups pop up of Christadelphians, and they're trying to talk about harder subjects, and I think there's people, again, with like good hearts who want to change things and improve things, knowing that people are hurt by certain views, and there's no good way around it. There's no good platform, there's no good way to do it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much, like there's that sort of reluctance, that sort of that idea that therapy, maybe I'm hoping that therapy has become some psychological support, therapeutic support has become more acceptable. I know when I was in the church, it
Yeah.
was still kind of frowned upon unless you could find a really good Christian therapist who again wasn't too Trinitarian or something. I don't know what the qualifications
Yeah.
for
Oh my
a good
God.
Christian therapist is,
Yeah.
but just that sort of comfort level with openness, or how to handle these issues. I mean, in any group there's going to be some really tough stuff that ends up happening and coming up, whether it's within a marriage, whether it's a family. There's just abuse that's going to happen, and how to handle it. And I think as a whole, because of this the nature of the group and also the structure and the rigidity of the group, there isn't a lot of room to move, and there isn't a lot of knowledge or sophistication on how to handle any of this stuff. I did see at the end of that issue that you'd sent me, Zinnia, there was something about you can get trained on how to deal with abuse systems. So it's something I had never seen before. Did you notice that? It's like on the very last page.
Was it the one that was it Ecclesia Safe?
Yes.
Yes, I have my own thoughts on that. Yep,
Yeah.
I have my own thoughts on that, and it's definitely going to be mentioned in my episode.
Yeah.
When I interview with Heather, and Heather's actually going to interview me.
Oh, very cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you hear the stories, and it's just in a group like this, just because there isn't really that openness to outside intervention and help.
Yeah.
How do you handle that with people who are just basically amateurs trying to handle something that's really should be handled by professionals?
Yep, I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, I would say there's no law enforcement on there. There's no one with any training, as far as I know, on like psychological stuff, children's welfare, any of that. So yeah, I have my own thoughts on that.
Yeah.
Yep. So the last thing for the types of things women can do is motherhood, but we're going to kind of breeze through that because we are limited on time. But basically, women are highly honored as mothers, and they are forbidden the freedom to refuse this role, was one of the things from your thesis. And that, as Christadelphians said, that a mother, being a mother, will provide the basis of her salvation, which is pretty crazy. So we'll just leave you to think about that for how motherhood is treated in the Christadelphias, so we can wind down to what is the result of these 5 conditions, as well as the wider structure of how women are treated in Christadelphia. And what I was able to kind of synthesize using your thesis as a basis to understand women in Christadelphia, especially having been out of it for a little while, was that you really end up with 3 options. You kind of have one option to circumvent it, and as we talked about earlier, be the neck that controls the head, as the Greek mother said. You can also accept it and say, this is my place. I am willing to kind of trade off my ability to speak and having to wear these head coverings and whatever in order to fit into this community, to see my family every Sunday. Whatever it is that you're getting out of the ecclesia is worth the trade-off of having less freedoms. Or your final option is really to leave, where you say, this is not going to work for me. I am looking for freedom. I'm not willing to make that trade off. And so they leave. And so I wanted to read a few of your comments from your article about why women, it seems like, are almost pushed towards leaving. So the first point was really that even the brothers are almost powerless within this system to change it. And so the quote was, even the contemporary publications of the more influential brothers have no real power to overhaul the system. They can't direct the church via their articles, but only in areas where Thomas or Roberts have not spoken. So it's kind of like we were talking about with the Tidings magazine. I think they see problems and they want to help address them and they want to help guide them, but they have no power. So even though they're, maybe recognizable names or anything, they can't say, oh, Thomas or Roberts said this, so this is what we're going to change. They really have no authority like those 2 brothers once had. The other thing is that women can't change it, so the men can't change it, was that quote. This one's also the women. The quote was, Christadelphian women do not have much hope for an increase in feminist consciousness in a system that rigorously resists change or dissent of any kind. So if the men aren't going to change it, the women also aren't going to change it. They don't have the power, and they can't really do much in this system to change it. The next one was that, quote, modernity is refused and ignored as something else that will pass away. So basically ignore that everyone around you is more feminist and that you're wearing pants 6 days a week. On the 7th day of the week, you can't. And then you also are distracted by the future. So this is interesting. And I put these 2 together as a sense of like how the sense of time is weird with Christadelphians, where, quote, millennialist ideas, so it's like that end of the world kind of stuff, I think, among the Christadelphians may make frustration with the group's policies only a transitory problem that can be dealt with until Jesus returns. So there's also being so focused on the future of like, oh, well, it's only a problem till the kingdom comes, so you never address it. So you're also like, well, we're not supposed to be of this world, and so you ignore everything that's modern, and at the same time you say, well, it's not a problem for today, it's a problem for tomorrow, and tomorrow Jesus is going to deal with it, so I don't have to deal with it. So another quote was, those who might become deeply frustrated with their situation may view attempts at revolution within the group as pointless. So again, the fact that brothers aren't going to change it, the sisters aren't going to change it, and no one's going to talk about it because it's a problem for Jesus to solve, why are you even trying to change it? Like at that point, there's no hope for you really. And so then we have that women really can't do anything. And so I guess that would really be all of the quotes that I pulled about why women would really be pushed towards leaving. Because what are they there to stay for? What hope do they really have of changing it?
I mean, it was very rare for me to know someone who had left. I mean,
Really?
I knew I would, again, it was kind of like a rumor, or you'd know someone had left and you never saw them again or interacted with them again because they weren't at the Bible schools.
Yeah.
They just sort of would disappear, especially women. Whereas I think the men usually, if they left, it was like some sort of more of a behavioral problem, or they kind of flamed out, and everyone. I don't know. So and I think it might be related to just the ties within the church are so close and so tight. The family element, I was reading actually about the Amish, because I was actually going to visit my family who live kind of near some Amish settlements, and we were going to do that weird touristy thing where you go and stare at humans.
No, I thought that's the part where you roll your windows down here, clip, clop, clip, clop, clip, clop from their horse and buggies.
What's it like over there? You're sort of staring at them like they're in a zoo or something. And I was reading about them just because I'm a nerd who likes to prepare herself for whenever I do anything. So, and it was saying that in Amish group communities, and the Amish lifestyle is very much a religious community, but it's made up of like 30 different subsets of Amish belief, ranging from very, very conservative to actually very liberal or less conservative. I don't know, however you want to frame it.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Yeah, within that structure though, there's
like the Mennonites, sort of, are sort of one end.
Yeah, I've seen them with like braces and stuff, and I'm like, that seems odd. So probably more on the liberal end of that.
There's fascinating, whole other topic, but there's like old order Amish, and then there's kind of the hip young cool Mennonite folks, but it's like the liberal side of that group tends to have more people leaving than the very conservative side of the Amish faith.
Yeah,
interesting.
In terms of the numbers changing, the numbers stay steadier, and the more conservative are, the steadier the numbers become, because the impact or the ramifications of leaving are that much more, almost not deadly, but like. You are in the Amish tradition. If you become shunned, you do not talk to your family ever again.
Okay, I think this is a great transition to actually the last part of our talk of today that I had pulled from your thesis. So really bring us to the end of your thesis that we're discussing. Was that there was a quote, "These type of churches require a belief system so strong and so encompassing that members ultimately share more in common with their foes within the church than they do with those outside the church." So again, it's basically your identity becomes it, and the stronger it is and the more it takes over your life. So again, like the more conservative presumably have more rules, more time commitments, whatever it is that makes it more of an impact on your life. That actually is a way of keeping you in the community. So as you said, with the conservatives are more likely to stay. I think that's basically very much in alignment with your comment in your thesis.
It's sort of fascinating and sort of...
It's counterintuitive.
Yes.
You think, oh, it's so strict, they must hate that and want to leave.
Right.
But it's basically, it is so encompassing that it's hard to even think about leaving, that it's so dangerous to even think that potentially. It's so hard to have contacts that would enable you to be able to leave because it has such a strong impact on your life. And you realize that that's also hard to leave. Even just people in our group, people are going through a lot of hard stuff often when they leave. It's very challenging.
Well, yeah, and I can see the more conservative it is, it's like a completely different world from the outside world, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would be making a huge leap instead of just a small step.
I watched a Netflix documentary to share more examples, and it was the fundamentalist group of the Mormons, and it was on Netflix. It's called like Keep Sweet, and a few people who are featured in it had grown up in it. That was all they ever knew. And they left, and it was so weird seeing like pictures of them in the group compared to where they were, where their entire dress changed. And so there was really even no way of like slipping out. Like you were in basically a uniform. So if you were even walking down the road, people would see you. They made it physically hard to leave, where it was hard to like, you'd have to get a ride out of town, but there was like security and all this stuff. And even once you got out, the way they thought, they were they were not very easily able to adjust. The one girl said, like, I couldn't understand anything culturally. I felt like an alien every day. People would be joking about movies and she's never heard of them, and TV shows and all these cultural references, what's nearby. And she just had no education in the world around her. So she just had such a hard time. So it's very understandable that she felt safer in the environment that was very unsafe and made her very unhappy because it was familiar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think about when I left, I was a young woman who I had never, dated other than in the church. And when I left, I had to navigate this whole world of like, how do I date someone that isn't Christadelphian? Like, and it was really, in some ways, I think it could have been gone really poorly because I was very naive and I could have been very dangerous because I didn't know how to set limits. Because I just assumed they knew what limits were because you don't do certain things until you're married, kind of thing. Like, and so I had to like reinvent I had to reinvent an entire basic moral system for myself because I no longer had other people telling me what my moral system was, or
and they weren't on the same page. You weren't dating people who had agreed to the same system where you would be like, oh, what are you doing? And be like, yeah, I know you're right. But like you had to actually talk about it and like learn communication skills.
And I was using things like, I was like, well, they must all date like the women do in Cosmo magazine because Cosmo magazine talks a lot about dating. It's not a good place to go to for advice about dating, it turns out. So, so things like that, like totally, like I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that leaving the Christadelphians was that extreme, but it is I'm sure
it's
both
still
of
a cultural
you
shock.
relate to many of those stories from when you left. And there's so many of those stories, like, I don't know, there's, that book Educated by Tara Westover, we talked briefly about.
Everyone loves that book. Yeah.
It's sort of like this big, huge, popular book. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a bestseller when it came out that year. Everyone was talking about it. I read that one. I gave it to a Jehovah's Witness and she never gave it back. I hope she's doing okay.
And there's this little trad wife.
Who are very much not traditional wives. Just gonna throw that out there. It's just sexism. So enjoy your that. There's a really good commentary by Esme Louise, who's does like a sex historian basically, but she's really cool. So look up Trad Wives Esme Louise if you want some good analysis on that.
We've been and there's like the Mormon Housewives or something that just recently people have been talking a lot about that.
Yeah, it's called The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
I don't know what platform it's on, but someone posted today. I saw online that they were watching it, and I was like,
I think it might be on Netflix.
To my list. If it's on Netflix, I might watch it. If it's on something else, I don't know.
But just as a woman who's left a very conservative Christian church, I can relate to so many things that these women are talking about, and there's just sort of different flavors of the same story.
Yeah.
And
but the same structures, they always use the dress, the sex, they always try to control the same things. So there's so much overlap still.
Yeah. And even within Jewish communities or Muslim communities, I mean, there's tons of those stories as well as sort of like how people navigating leaving those communities.
And on a topic of leaving still, we've talked about another reason why it can be so hard for Christadelphians to leave is that, as you pointed out in your thesis, they don't really have the same ability to choose when they are born into it. And so far, everyone I've interviewed has been born into it. And I think that's going to continue to be the trend because we've done surveys. And I think it's like 90% at least of people in our ex-Christadelphian group were born into it. It is absolutely the majority. And so at that point, when you try to leave, you're very much challenging the norms. And you then have to deal with how your family responds. You have to deal with that. And usually it's a very emotional experience. I'm going to tell my story, and so I'll talk about it. It was definitely very emotional in my family, how it was received and all that kind of thing. And it absolutely made it harder that it was all family. It was very much, even being an adult, leaving over 18 is not treated as such where it's like, oh, it's your decision, do what's right. No, absolutely not. So I think it's also because they make it feel like life and death and they believe it's about life and death, the rules of decorum also kind of go out the window, in my experience, where people are doing things that are unreasonable and inappropriate even to try to convince you to stay. It gets very strange.
Well, it's so hard. I mean, it's just not like you're just done. Like you go, it's the rest of your life. You're sort of navigating how to work with people who are still a part of the group that you've left. And the act of leaving is a sort of a declaration of, I don't think what you do isn't aligned with the way I think. It's just always going to be awkward and tricky. And
Yeah.
I will give my family credit that, we've continued to be able to be in touch and
Mm-hmm.
to spend time together and to have loving relationships, but it's still sometimes difficult and awkward and sometimes painful.
Yeah.
And I think that's always going to be true because we do have this sort of divide that is between us. And I wish that wasn't the case, but it is the way it is. And there's sort of a level of acceptance you have to have, and a little bit of pain that will always be there. I think that's I've had lots of therapy and lots of good support over the
Very
years,
good.
kind of
Very
work
good.
through this, but it's tough. It's really tough.
Yeah. It definitely has changed my family's dynamic forever. It's interesting is different siblings have left at different times. It's continued to change the dynamic each time someone leaves. Um, but it was always a big impact on my parents. Their one goal in life to be successful parents really was not just raising us to adulthood, to be, feed us and clothe us. It was also to make sure she had
Yeah.
4 kids that were going to go to the kingdom in her belief system.
Yeah.
So it was really just devastating for her. And I'm sure a lot of other families experience that. And I'm sure there's people who want to keep their parents happy and not do that. Um, so it becomes very challenging because it's almost always disrupting a family system when someone leaves.
Yeah, I always wonder that when I think of certain people that I knew that are still Christadelphians, as far as I know. And I
Yeah.
really do wonder how much of it is like, are they just doing it because they're keeping the peace in the family? Like,
Yeah.
but then it's like, how much of your life are you giving up if that's your choice?
Is it really worth
Is
it?
it really worth it?
Because
Yeah.
it's comfortable, it's easier, causes less conflict. So, but I mean, there's definitely yeah, I've definitely seen it where there was people sitting in the meeting who, leave right at the end. They don't volunteer for much.
Hmm.
They don't seem to have a lot of comments on biblical stuff. They never make it to the weeknight Bible classes. Like they're not doing all this stuff. And you could see like the one sister I talked about earlier where she was really, you could tell she was reading her Bible and she was always engaged and always active and always involved in the ecclesia. So I never really had any doubts that she's still there or whatnot. But there's some people who was like, yeah, she kind of was like hiding in the back. She was kind of quiet. Like I wonder if she was there because she had to be
Hmm.
to keep up appearances, or if she really wanted to be. But some people go there, I'm sure, can go most of their lives.
Hmm.
It's almost like on a cruise control, just being like, well, I'm a Christadelphian because I've always
Yeah.
been one.
Or yeah, there's definitely people who kind of stay in they kind of straddle it. There's quiet
Yeah.
quitting, but then there's also people who are like, well,
Yeah.
I'll go, I'll be nice to everybody, I'll hang, and but because I don't want to make everybody mad and don't want to upset my parents, but I'm not really going to engage otherwise.
And it is interesting how so far everyone I've interviewed has had a period where they have basically emotionally left the building, but they're still physically there. And I
Mm.
think a lot of the reason for that is because of that pressure where they, whether consciously or unconsciously, are still showing up. And they haven't made the declaration, like as you said, yet. But I feel like if they hadn't had that pressure, they probably, most cases, would have left earlier
Hmm.
Mm.
and just been like, "Oh, I'm not really feeling it." But like Heather, you were saying you were having like panic attacks. Like it was a hard
Oh,
thing to
yeah.
Yeah.
just not go
Well, and also
emotionally.
what you were saying about all of us have grown up in it. We were brought up in it. So
Yeah.
there's not like a roadmap for like how to move forward
No.
because you haven't seen anybody else do it. And like
Yeah.
Amy, like you were saying, you knew women who had left, but like after they leave, you never hear from them again. And that was my
Mm,
experience too.
yep.
It
Me
really
too.
wasn't until basically that Facebook group in
Right.
Yep.
2008 that I was like, oh, I can actually connect with people that left because
Yeah.
there was like no other way to get in touch with them.
It
Yeah.
was
That's how
so
you.
thrilling. It really
I
was.
love knowing who left because I'm always
Yeah.
checking. Like, is someone else that I know gonna join the group?
Yeah, me too.
And it also helps me because, like, I have a mixture of Facebook friends, and honestly, I have no idea who's still Christadelphian and who's not. Because I would love to be like, oh, okay, like maybe like I shouldn't have this person. I should. But I'm like, well, like I don't know. Like I don't even know where they are on anything in their life. Like I don't know what we agree on or not. And some, it's like, well, we were friends when we were younger. So like, I don't know. It's just I don't know what to do with it. And it's interesting because I do wonder. It makes me wonder when I see their name. I'm like, what do we still have in common? Like, are you still like a diehard Christadelphian, or have you left? Like, you never know.
Yeah.
So it's I appreciate having the group so I can find out sometimes. I think one nice thing about the podcast is that by telling people stories of life after leaving, it starts to show a roadmap of what so many people's paths have been on, and give people some hope and encouragement if they are already on that path of leaving.
Well, it's funny because, we talked to loop back to the very beginning of our conversation. We were talking about how I went off to grad school and ended up studying the Christadelphians, and it was an opportunity for me to have that objectivity. Like that Tara Westover book that Educated, she basically went and studied sort of family systems and therapy and conservatism, and she did a very similar thing. So that was kind of
I guess
my
that's true,
approach
yeah.
for how I sort of survived and was able to take the step back. But I think that Marlene Winnell book, Leaving the Fold, that one I read, I think,
Oh,
before
yeah.
the ex-Christadelphian Facebook group, and that was a lifesaver for me because it's not about Christadelphianism, but it is about the idea of leaving a group of which you've been a part of your whole life or for a significant amount of time, and it helped sort of affirm my own path, and was like, okay, there are other people who've done through this and have survived, and I can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually read, there was a blogger that I followed who was an ex-Mormon, and even though I didn't relate to the theology of it, it was just like the leaving a group that you've been
Yeah.
brought up in, and she was like a, fifth generation or whatever Mormon, so it was relatable.
So helpful.
Yeah, I love that we can find those stories. I've did the same. I found what I could. Again, realizing that Christadelphians as a group are so small, there was not a lot that I could find in the mainstream. So you kind of have to find groups that are similar. It's just kind of what you did in your thesis, and we've all seen it in other ways, just these overlaps between Christadelphians and other groups, which can be really helpful, especially for people leaving. The end result, really, of this was, quote, the dissenters' only choice is to leave, which further serves to perpetuate a group that is of the same mind and purpose. So, kind of the end result of people either stay and accept it, or they leave and change their own lives outside of the system, is it leaves behind people who are basically stuck, always doing the same thing. And as we've seen, there's really no way to change it. So, and I've even heard some people say that they think that Christadelphians may even become more extreme because of this, because you continue to have people staying, and it's going to be the more diehards staying. And even like your research had found with the comment you had made before about people in more liberal groups, and all that being the ones who are leaving more. It's interesting that potentially it's going to continue to get more conservative, and we've already seen it already has gotten more conservative in some ways, at least since it was first founded.
Yeah, it almost has to in order to preserve what it is. It's like it has to become more and more rigid in order to maintain the borders.
Yeah, and that's what their identity is. So if you change any of it, as we've already said earlier, you wouldn't be the Christadelphians.
Yeah, and I do think when you have your conversation about sort of LGBTQ issues, that will be a really interesting part of it, because how do you, as we as a society grow, sort of have more and more understanding of how this works, biologically speaking, I don't know. At the same time, scientifically, I don't know if that's of great interest to the Christadelphians, just being, the way that they're thinking necessarily. But although there is this sort of intellectualism that I think Christadelphians like to say, that they're always looking for the truth, and the truth is the most important thing.
What's the Hebrew word for sex and gender? Like they're going to be like, pull out your concordance.
Yeah. But again, questioning of gender roles and gender norms, or it's just not gonna. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah, and it's funny because in a way, we've all lived at different times. But you wrote this, it was like 25 years ago now, and I left, maybe 10 years ago. So not, super recently or super long ago, but I haven't seen anything different. Like you would hope that things would have changed, but you were so correct. I haven't seen anything change. I see all these problems that you stated. I've seen all these systems that you've stated. The Christadelphians are such a time capsule that even reading this later, it sounds exactly like the Christadelphians.
Oh, really? Wow.
25 years later, honestly, it could have been written this year, And I
Wow.
would have been like, oh, yeah, they probably have some sisters' teas. There's still kind of like people talking about these little things to try to make it more palatable, make it a little better, like a Band-Aid on the big problem. But I feel like they still have these problems. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if they always will, honestly, just given the structure of it. And, all your arguments seem to indicate that potentially.
It's so interesting, and there's the one thing that I keep going back to in my head though is social media is the big differentiator between
Mm-hmm.
25 years ago, and how much has that changed or not changed the group, but that it has created an additional opportunity for subgroups and enclaves
Yes.
of sort of ways to discuss things that wouldn't normally be discussed. So how that has changed, or it would be if I did a coda somehow to the thesis or some sort of follow up, I would
Mm-hmm.
really be interested to kind of dig into that and like how the ex-Christadelphian group serves this need, particularly.
Yay.
It's sort of fascinating. I mean, it's an output of Christadelphia. It's a subgroup.
Honestly,
Yeah.
yeah, not only reevaluating where things are in Christadelphia, but the ex-Christadelphians themselves, who, now are going on like a while they've existed. So this has been a great thing to be a part of. I'm
Yeah.
glad that I joined for sure.
Yeah.
This
Yeah, me
podcast would
too.
not exist without that Facebook group. For sure.
Well, I think it's interesting, Zinnia, what you're saying, that when you read this, because when I was reading it, I was keeping in mind that it was 25 years ago, and to me, I was like, that was when I was like in the thick of it. So it was very familiar to me. But I did wonder as I was reading it, I'm like, does this hold up 25 years later?
Yeah, of the three of us, I have the most
Yeah,
recent.
you're the most recent.
Left.
And I guess like you were saying, you have friends on social media that you don't really know if they're still Christadelphian or not. And that's kind of the same with me. And so from my perspective, like what I see, I'm like assuming that they're more liberal because of what I see these people
I just kind of
sharing.
guess based on how they're spending their weekends and stuff. I'm
Right.
like, are
Exactly.
you missing meeting this weekend?
Yeah.
Like I still think about that. I'm like, are they being a good Christadelphian?
Yeah. But so I'm like, well, maybe my perspective is just skewed because I'm seeing more liberal people, and I don't really see into the heart of the group and how things really are.
Yeah, I mean, and I know that there's at least one or two people that have reached out who've left more recently. I don't know, again, which region of the world they are, because again, there's so many variables going on with talking about Christadelphian experiences, because it is all over and people of different generations and everything. I'd be curious if they have anything where they're like, oh yeah, this and this has changed. But honestly, this could have been written, I feel like, this year, honestly, reading it. It's the same rules. It's the same structures. And I have yet to see someone find a way to subvert this spread out Christadelphian system. Again, I think if someone was able to centralize power and convince everyone, that would cause the biggest changes, whether positive or negative, that would cause the biggest changes. And so I think still never having any one figure, it's helped preserve this so much. And again, certain ecclesias might have changed. I have heard of some ecclesias where they've kind of had a more charismatic person take more influence, and they have had more of a culty vibe, but it's more of like a family cult kind of vibe within the Christadelphian system more than the whole Christadelphian system becoming that. I think the kind of more classical structure, the more moderate ones in the middle and so on, haven't really had that. But I think they're, again, so it hasn't been able to hit the whole group. If those things have come, it just stays kind of the same.
Yeah, I mean, you'll get the splinters. You may have a splinter group, but
there's like 5 at least.
Yeah,
like
still can't get
Brian,
over
Dawn,
the
unamended.
Like the unamended, like they're not, like no one even really fully understands why that they're in a separate group.
I can't understand. I read it and I was trying to figure out. I was like, am I unamended or amended? I don't know. Thank God someone decided for me, because I don't know. I don't care.
Well, I'm still not clear. I think I grew up amended, right? Like,
the amended was the larger one. So if you went to Shippensburg, you were amended, basically.
Yes.
And if you wore a head covering on Sunday, most weeks you were amended, basically. Those are my tips. Those are my hot tips for remembering. Because it hardly came up except in disagreements over amended and unamended. Like, I didn't know growing up until maybe even after I was baptized. I don't even know if I knew beforehand. Maybe a little bit, because I think one of my uncles was involved on like a committee to reunite, whatever that was called, like a reconciliation group. And so I think I only knew about it from him being involved in that and hearing about, like, oh, he's going to Canada to try to help because there's splinters going on.
And they never
Canada was
reconciled, right?
fine. I don't think so.
That's wild.
But I think this is probably a good time to wrap up. We went a little bit over time, but I think we were able to capture in a pretty good length of time. I mean, this was like how many pages? I actually have my printed out version here.
Wow,
Yeah,
you printed
over,
it out.
Yeah, it was over 50 pages. Read it twice. You did a fantastic job. I thought your analysis was really good. I thought you covered the topics. I think you handled it very maturely. I think your research seemed really good. So I thought it was great. I really appreciate that you were willing to share it with me. I'm sure it was weird, being like, oh, let me tell her about my master's thesis from 25 years ago. But I was so interested in it. I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed talking about it. And I'm so glad you were willing to come on the episode to talk about it with us.
It was my pleasure. That work that I did, it sort of goes out in the world. And you're like, will anyone ever read this? And apparently, Zinnia
I will. and Heather was very interested.
Well.
Yes,
poke around in it, and I mean, I'm glad that some of the insights are helpful. I mean, there are other people who've written about the group, obviously, but I don't think so much. The women certainly hasn't been. Something that has I don't know that there's a whole lot else out there, but there is a lot of great material out there in the world about women in conservative groups that if anyone's interested, I'm happy to send them references or
and you had a whole bibliography, so I'm sure you could even just send them a snippet of that, of some of the resources you used for this. And I'm sure there's more recent stuff as well, but as a place to start, for sure, some books and stuff like that.
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming on today, Heather. And thank you so much, Amy, for opening up with talking about your thesis, allowing us both to read it and have this wonderful conversation about it. I think the quotes show that there was so much value in it. And we will see about sharing that resource with people. So stay tuned. Hopefully that will be in the show notes, some information on how to read that. So thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. And I hope to talk to you both soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who has helped make this podcast possible. Today, I'd like to thank Heather for editing this episode, Al Kroons for creating our intro music, and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us on the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. Or if you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. See you next time.